Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleep Science. Tonight you find yourself standing on the edge of a vast, wind-brushed plain, where the ground is cracked like old pottery and the air tastes faintly of dust and rain that never quite arrived. The sun hangs low, casting long shadows that stretch like dark fingers over the earth, and beneath your boots lies stone that once was soft mud. You probably won't survive this. At least not if you had wandered here a few million years ago without sunscreen, insect repellent, or the very concept of shoes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as you settle in, tell me where you're listening from and what your local time is. I like imagining these stories drifting across different time zones, like quiet signals traveling through the dark. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch down and brush your fingers across the rock. What you're touching are footprints, ancient ones, pressed into sediment and hardened by time. Not yours, not mine, not anyone you could ever meet. The most famous of these are the Lascaux footprints in Tanzania, discovered in 1976 by Mary Leakey's team. They date back about 3.6 million years and are widely accepted as evidence of early hominins walking upright. That's the mainstream fact, solid and reassuring. Our distant ancestors were already striding confidently across volcanic ash, while saber-toothed cats probably judged them from nearby bushes. You trace the outline of one print in your imagination: heel, arch, toes. It looks astonishingly modern, unsettlingly modern. You expect something more primitive, maybe a cartoon caveman foot with exaggerated toes, but no. It looks like yours might look if pressed into wet cement outside a freshly paved driveway. Please don't try that. Your landlord will have opinions. Here's where the unease creeps in. Some researchers have pointed out subtle details. The stride length suggests efficient bipedalism. The gait appears confident, almost relaxed. Historians still argue whether these prints represent a direct ancestor of modern humans or a side branch that eventually vanished. Evolution, after all, isn't a tidy ladder. It's more like a tangled bush that someone forgot to prune. As the wind whistles across this imagined plain, you realize something simple and enormous. Someone was here. Someone stood exactly where you're standing now, millions of years before your name was ever whispered into existence. The earth remembers pressure, it remembers weight, it remembers contact. And footprints aren't the only impressions left behind. In New Mexico at White Sands National Park, scientists announced in 2021 the discovery of human footprints dating back roughly 21,000 to 23,000 years. That pushes human presence in North America earlier than many textbooks once allowed. For decades, the Clovis first model suggested humans arrived around 13,000 years ago, but these tracks pressed into ancient lakebed sediments suggest otherwise. It's the scientific equivalent of finding out someone arrived at the party hours before you thought it started. Not everyone immediately agreed with the dating methods, of course. Historians still argue whether the seeds used for radiocarbon dating in the sediment layers could have skewed the timeline. Debate in academia is less dramatic than TV makes it seem: fewer thrown chairs, more raised eyebrows, but it matters. Because if the timeline shifts, so does the story of how we came to be here. You stand, brushing imaginary dust from your knees, and consider something stranger. There have been fringe claims, footprints allegedly found in much older rock layers alongside dinosaur tracks. The Paluxy River prints in Texas, for instance, were once heralded by some as evidence that humans and dinosaurs coexisted. That would certainly spice up your next museum visit. However, detailed studies eventually showed many of those human prints were either eroded dinosaur tracks or outright carvings. It's a reminder that the Earth tells stories, but sometimes we misread the handwriting. Still, the very existence of such debates reveals a deeper longing. You want there to be something older, something unexpected, a whisper of a chapter missing from the book, because footprints are intimate. They're not like bones scattered and clinical behind glass displays. A footprint captures a moment mid-movement, a step in progress, a weight shift, perhaps even a stumble. You can almost see the individual turning their head toward a distant sound. Wind in tall grass, maybe, or the low rumble of an approaching predator. You can almost feel the warmth of volcanic ash beneath their skin. There's a quirky tidbit you might enjoy. At Lascaux, researchers found that one set of footprints appears to overlap another, suggesting two individuals walking together. Some have even speculated, very gently, very cautiously, that it could represent a small group, perhaps even a family. No one knows for certain, but the idea of ancient beings strolling side by side across fresh ash feels oddly comforting. Prehistoric date night, minus the restaurant reservation. And here you are millions of years later, following in their steps without realizing it most days. You walk across sidewalks, across tiled kitchen floors, across damp grass in the early morning. You leave faint impressions that vanish almost instantly. The difference is permanence. Their steps fossilized, yours evaporate. But imagine this: if tectonic shifts, volcanic ash, and the precise chemistry of sediment can preserve a single footfall for millions of years, what else might be waiting beneath layers of stone? What if entire chapters of presence, structures, tools, symbols were pressed into the planet and then erased by time's patient erosion? You glance across the horizon again. The plain stretches quiet and indifferent. The wind keeps moving. It doesn't care who walked here first. And yet you do, because the existence of those footprints means the story didn't begin with you. It didn't even begin with what you'd recognize as fully human. It began with something that balanced on two legs, testing gravity in a world far wilder than yours. Something that left evidence not by design but by accident. A step, a pause, another step. And in that simple rhythm, you sense the faintest echo of a possibility. That the ground beneath you may hold more than evolution's steady march. It may hold interruptions, experiments, civilizations rising and dissolving like mist. For now, though, you stay with the prints. The oldest handwriting on Earth, the first quiet proof that something was here before you, and that the planet remembers. The wind over the plain fades into cool, mineral-scented air as you step forward, not across open land now, but into shadow. The light narrows, the temperature drops, and the world becomes stone and echo. You run your fingers along a cave wall slick with condensation, and when your eyes adjust, you see them. Animals burst from the rock. Bison with lowered heads, horses mid-gallop, deer stretching their thin legs as if caught between stillness and motion. In France's Lascaux cave, discovered in 1940 by 4 teenagers and a dog with excellent timing. More than 600 paintings cover the walls. They're around 17,000 years old. That's the mainstream fact, carefully dated and widely accepted. Upper Paleolithic humans created sophisticated art deep underground, using mineral pigments like ochre and charcoal. You tilt your head. The animals are layered, overlapping, sometimes painted on top of one another, as if the wall were a living canvas used for generations. The torchlight imagined in your hand flickers, and the figures seem to move. Some researchers have suggested that the placement of the paintings in hard-to-reach chambers implies ritual purpose. You don't crawl hundreds of feet into darkness just to redecorate. Historians still argue whether these images were primarily spiritual, educational, or simply artistic expression. Were they hunting magic, meant to ensure a successful chase, early storytelling, or something more symbolic? Maps of constellations disguised as herds. The debate hums softly in academic journals, polite but persistent. You notice something else. Many of the animals are rendered with remarkable anatomical accuracy. Muscles bulge in the right places. Proportions feel intentional. These weren't crude doodles made during a bored afternoon. The artists understood movement. Some walls even use the natural contours of the rock to create a three-dimensional effect. A bulge becomes a shoulder. A crack becomes the line of a back. It's prehistoric augmented reality, no headset required. And here's a quirky detail. In Lascaux, one of the rare human figures appears with a bird-like head, lying near a wounded bison. Some fringe interpretations suggest shamanic transformation, humans becoming animals in trance states. Others simply see a symbolic scene, perhaps mythic. Either way, the image feels different, less documentary, more dreamlike. You walk deeper. At Chauvet Cave, also in France and even older, around 30,000 to 32,000 years old, there are depictions of lions, rhinoceroses, and bears. Not just prey animals, but predators. The charcoal shading is so skillful that when modern archaeologists first announced the age, some experts were skeptical. The art seemed too advanced for its time, as if someone had skipped a few chapters in the development of creativity. That discomfort is telling. You tend to imagine progress as a slow upward slope, stick figures first, masterpieces later. But here, tens of thousands of years ago, people were already mastering perspective and motion in firelit darkness. It's humbling, slightly inconvenient for your tidy timeline. And then there are the handprints. Negative hand stencils appear in caves from Spain to Indonesia. A hand pressed against stone, pigment blown around it, leaving behind a pale silhouette. Some date back more than 40,000 years. In 2014, scientists confirmed that cave art in Sulawesi, Indonesia, is at least that old, suggesting symbolic behavior was not confined to Europe. Creativity wasn't a regional quirk. It was human. You lift your own hand and imagine pressing it against the wall. The gesture feels intimate, immediate. Someone stood here and did exactly that. The size of some stencils suggests they were made by women or even adolescents, challenging older assumptions that cave art was the exclusive domain of male hunters. Historians still argue whether gender roles in Paleolithic societies were as rigid as once believed. And then come the more speculative ideas. Some researchers cautiously have explored whether certain clusters of dots and animal groupings might correspond to star patterns. A 2018 study proposed that some cave paintings could represent constellations like Taurus or Orion. It's not universally accepted. Critics argue the patterns may be coincidental, but the possibility lingers. What if these walls are not just art, but records? Sky maps encoded in ochre. You feel the weight of that thought. If ancient people were tracking the heavens tens of thousands of years ago, then their awareness of time and cycles was deeper than you might casually assume. They weren't just surviving, they were observing. There's even a fringe whisper, soft but persistent, that some cave imagery resembles abstract symbols not fully understood. Zigzags, grids, repeating marks. Were these early writing systems? Probably not in the formal sense, but they hint at structured thought. Repetition implies intention. It's tempting, standing here, to imagine that the caves are archives. Not accidental decoration, but deliberate preservation. But preservation requires foresight, and foresight implies long-term thinking. You exhale slowly. The cave air smells ancient, damp limestone and time. A droplet falls somewhere in the darkness with a soft plink, like a clock ticking at geological speed. Mainstream archaeology sees these paintings as evidence of cognitive modernity, proof that by at least 40,000 years ago, humans were thinking symbolically, imagining beyond the immediate moment. That alone is extraordinary. You don't need aliens or lost super civilizations to feel awe here, and yet, there's something about the consistency, the global spread, the sudden flourishing of art across continents. It feels less like a flicker and more like a sunrise. Historians still argue whether this creative explosion was truly sudden or simply appears that way due to gaps in the archaeological record. Because that's the thing about caves. They preserve what the open world erases. Wood rots, fabric dissolves, entire settlements vanish, but stone keeps secrets. You step back toward the entrance, the daylight a pale ribbon ahead. The animals remain behind you, frozen mid-stride. They've been running across these walls for tens of thousands of years, untouched by weather, guarded by darkness. Someone was here, not just walking, not just surviving, watching, imagining, recording. And whether they meant to or not, they left evidence, not only that they existed, but that they saw the world as something worth capturing, something worth remembering. As you emerge into the light, again blinking against the brightness, you carry that quiet realization with you. Before cities, before writing, before metal and engines and glowing screens, there were minds just as alive as yours, standing in flickering firelight, turning stone into story. And if they were capable of that so long ago, you can't help but wonder what else might have flickered briefly into existence, and then slipped back into shadow. The daylight feels harsher now. You leave the cool hush of painted caves behind and step into heat, the kind that presses against your skin and fills your lungs with fine, restless sand. The horizon shimmers. Dunes roll outward like a frozen ocean, and somewhere beneath them lie straight lines that shouldn't exist. You kneel and brush away grains in your mind, revealing the edge of stone. Not a loose rock, a cut block. Smooth, intentional across Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, and beyond. Entire cities once rose from landscapes that now seem empty. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2560 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, remains one of the most precisely constructed monuments in history. That's the mainstream fact. Ancient Egyptians, using organized labor and ingenious engineering, moved roughly 2.3 million limestone blocks into place. No anti-gravity devices, no secret laser levels, just math, manpower, and patience. Still, when you stand before it, at least in imagination, it feels impossible, each side aligned almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. The base nearly level despite spanning acres. You can't even assemble flat-pack furniture without a minor existential crisis. And here they are, stacking stones that weigh several tons. Historians still argue whether the workforce consisted mainly of seasonal laborers, skilled craftsmen, or a combination supported by a complex state economy. Evidence from workers' villages suggests they were not enslaved masses in chains, but organized crews with surprisingly decent diets. Bread, beer, camaraderie. Pyramid building, the original team-building retreat. But Egypt isn't alone in this architectural audacity. In Peru, at sites like Sacsayhuaman, massive stone blocks, some weighing over 100 tons, fit together so tightly you can't slide a piece of paper between them. The Inca achieved this without iron tools or the wheel. Mainstream archaeology explains it through careful stone shaping, abrasion techniques, and astonishing patience. You imagine workers tapping and grinding, lifting and aligning, guided by knowledge passed down over generations. And yet there's a whisper that never quite goes away. Some alternative theorists claim these structures suggest lost advanced technologies, Forgotten tools, perhaps even earlier civilizations that taught later cultures how to build. The idea is tantalizing. It turns history into a relay race, with knowledge handed off from one vanished society to the next. Most scholars remain cautious. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so far the physical record supports human ingenuity more than hidden high-tech ancestors. But the precision still startles you. Take Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley, flourishing around 2500 BCE. It featured a grid-planned layout, standardized brick sizes, and sophisticated drainage systems, indoor plumbing, essentially at a time when much of the world was still improvising with mud huts. The Great Bath, a large public water tank, suggests ritual or communal use. Urban planning wasn't a modern invention. It was already thriving 5,000 years ago. Historians still argue whether the Indus script, symbols found on seals and pottery, represents a fully developed writing system or something more limited. The script remains undeciphered. Imagine that, an entire civilization speaking to you across millennia, and you can't quite translate the message. You walk across another stretch of sand, and now you're in Mesopotamia, the city of Ziggurats rising in stepped layers toward the sky. Built as early as 2100 BCE, these massive temple complexes dominated the skyline. They were religious centers, administrative hubs, and statements of power all at once. Sun-baked bricks stacked into geometric mountains. There's something deeply human about building upward, as if height equals permanence. But permanence is fragile. Many of these cities were buried not by a single dramatic catastrophe, but by time, rivers shifting course, trade routes collapsing, drought creeping in quietly. Layers of habitation built atop older layers until the originals disappeared beneath accumulated dust. Archaeologists call these mounds tells, artificial hills made of centuries of living. You picture standing on one. Beneath your feet, kitchens, workshops, bedrooms, forgotten toys, broken pottery, generations stacked like pages in a book. And then there's a more unsettling possibility. In Turkey, long before the pyramids, before pottery even, lies Göbekli Tepe, but you'll come to that later. For now, you sense the pattern, complexity emerging earlier than expected, precision appearing in places once dismissed as primitive. A quirky tidbit drifts into your thoughts. In ancient Egypt, workers sometimes left graffiti inside monuments, casual notes and crew names like Friends of Khufu. It's oddly comforting. Even in the shadow of eternity, someone scrawled what amounts to, "We were here," the ultimate ancient group chat. Yet some architectural mysteries remain genuinely puzzling. At Baalbek in Lebanon, the Temple of Jupiter rests on enormous stone blocks known as the trilithon, each weighing around 800 tons. How were they moved? The prevailing theory involves ramps, rollers, and coordinated labor. Still, standing before stones of that magnitude stretches your imagination. Historians still argue whether certain foundational layers at sites like Baalbek predate the Roman structures above them, hinting at earlier phases of construction we don't fully understand. Not necessarily a lost super-civilization, but perhaps chapters overwritten. You feel the heat ease slightly as evening approaches. The desert cools quickly, as if exhaling after holding its breath all day. Stars begin to appear overhead, sharp and innumerable. These cities, these buried geometries are evidence not just that humans were here, but that they organized, calculated, aligned, and envisioned structures meant to outlast them. And many did, but others vanished so thoroughly that only faint outlines remain, visible from satellite images or hinted at by subtle changes in soil color. Entire urban centers swallowed by jungle in Cambodia. Stone circles half buried in the British countryside. Foundations discovered accidentally during highway construction. History interrupting your commute. It makes you wonder how much has been erased. Wood decays, metal corrodes, mud brick melts back into earth. If a civilization built primarily with perishable materials, would you even know it existed 10,000 years later? That's the unsettling comfort of stone. It lingers. You stand once more, brushing sand from your hands, aware that beneath countless landscapes lie the bones of cities. Some we've uncovered, many we haven't. Someone was here before you, not just wandering, not just painting animals on cave walls, but designing grids, hauling megaliths, calculating alignments with the rising sun. And whether their knowledge flowed in a straight, steady line toward you, or rose, fell, and rose again in cycles remains part of the quiet mystery. The dunes shift softly in the cooling air. Beneath them, geometry sleeps. The sand thins beneath your feet, replaced by the faint creak of wood and the scent of salt. You're no longer standing in a desert, but on the deck of a ship that exists only in your imagination. Canvas sails straining, ropes humming in the wind, the horizon curved and endless. In your hands rests a map. Not a modern one with neat longitude and latitude lines, but parchment creased, faded, and just slightly unsettling. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map using earlier source material, some of which he claimed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. That's the mainstream anchor. The Piri Reis map exists, preserved on gazelle skin, showing parts of Europe, Africa, and the New World with surprising accuracy for its era. You run your fingers along its coastline. The bulge of West Africa is clear. The eastern edge of South America curves convincingly. Columbus had reached the Americas only 2 decades earlier, yet here they are, drawn in confident strokes. Historians generally agree that the map reflects accumulated knowledge from Portuguese and Spanish explorers, combined with earlier Islamic cartography traditions. It's a testament to how quickly information spread in the age of exploration. Sailors traded more than spices, they traded coastlines. But then there's the controversial detail. Some researchers in the 20th century claim that a portion of the Piri Reis map appears to depict Antarctica, specifically an ice-free coastline resembling Queen Maud Land. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, so how could a 16th century map show it? Mainstream scholars argue the resemblance is coincidental, likely a distorted extension of South America. Cartographic projection quirks can create illusions. Historians still argue whether the Antarctic interpretation is creative overreach or a genuine anomaly. The debate drifts between serious geographic analysis and late-night documentary speculation. You squint at the imagined parchment. Coastlines are tricky things. Even today, satellite measurements refine them constantly. Expecting perfect accuracy from Renaissance-era maps is like expecting your GPS to work flawlessly in a tunnel. It won't. It will calmly insist you're driving through a river. Still, the mystery lingers because it taps into a larger question. How much did ancient people really know about the shape of the Earth? Long before Columbus, the Greek scholar Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference around 240 BCE, with remarkable accuracy using shadows and geometry. That's a solid historical fact. No satellites, no space stations, just sticks, sunlight, and a mind that understood angles. The world was already being measured with surprising precision. And then there's the Orontius Phineus map of 1531, which also seems to show a southern continent. Some interpret it as another hint of advanced ancient geographic knowledge. Most historians, however, point out that many early maps included a hypothetical southern landmass, Terra Australis, believed necessary to balance the continents of the north. It was symmetry, not secret exploration. You feel the ship rock gently beneath you. Cartography in the ancient world was often speculative. Maps were living documents, blending observation with myth. Sea monsters lurked in uncharted waters, not because sailors routinely fought krakens, but because unknown spaces invited imagination. Here Be Dragons is less about zoology and more about humility. Still, some ancient maps genuinely impress. The Babylonian world map, carved into clay around the 6th century BCE, depicts a circular Earth surrounded by a bitter river. It's symbolic rather than geographically precise, but it reflects a worldview, attempting to structure reality. Order imposed on vastness. Historians still argue whether certain map fragments from antiquity indicate more extensive exploration than we currently credit. Did Phoenician sailors venture farther along African coasts than recorded? Herodotus wrote that Phoenicians circumnavigated Africa around 600 BCE under Pharaoh Necho. Some scholars find the account plausible, others remain skeptical. You imagine those ships hugging coastlines, navigating by stars, reading currents like subtle fingerprints in the sea. Knowledge accumulates quietly. A harbour here, a reef there, a reliable wind pattern at a certain latitude. And yet maps can vanish as easily as cities. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BCE, once housed hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Among them could have been geographic treatises, travel accounts, diagrams of lands now forgotten. The library's gradual decline and destruction over centuries remains one of history's most mourned losses. Historians still argue whether its burning was a single catastrophic event or a slow erosion through political and religious shifts. Imagine the knowledge that evaporated in smoke. There's a quirky fringe claim you might appreciate. Some have suggested that medieval Portolan charts, detailed nautical maps from the 13th to 16th centuries, are so accurate they imply the use of advanced surveying techniques not officially developed until later. Most experts attribute their precision to cumulative sailor reports and practical navigation, not lost high technology, but the sharpness of their coastlines is undeniably impressive. You lean over the railing of your imagined ship and look into dark water. If a prior civilization had mapped the world extensively and then vanished, wiped out by climate shifts or catastrophe, what would remain? Paper decays, ink fades, wood rots. Only copies survive, and copies of copies distort like whispered secrets. It's possible that knowledge has been rediscovered multiple times: astronomy, geometry, navigation, each generation thinking it's the first to chart the unknown, unaware of earlier attempts erased by time. The wind tugs at your map. You realize something subtle. Even if no mysterious ancient global civilization existed, the persistence of these cartographic puzzles reveals how incomplete your record is. History isn't a finished atlas. It's a draft. Coastlines change, sea levels rise and fall. During the last ice age, around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were over 100 meters lower than today. Vast stretches of continental shelf were dry land. Entire regions where people could have lived are now underwater. What maps might they have drawn? You fold the parchment carefully. Whether the Piri-Reis coastline is misunderstood artistry or faint echo of older knowledge, it reminds you that humans have long sought to see the whole, to trace edges, to define boundaries, to understand where they stand in relation to everything else. Someone before you looked at the horizon and refused to accept it as the end. They drew lines across uncertainty, and some of those lines still puzzle you. The ship sails onward into gathering dusk, the stars beginning to emerge overhead, ancient, patient witnesses to every map ever made and every coastline ever lost. The sea quiets, the imagined ship dissolving into darkness, and in its place you find yourself descending, not into water this time but into it. Cold surrounds you. You drift down through a blue so deep it almost turns black, sunlight thinning into pale ribbons above. Somewhere below, in 1901, sponge divers sheltering from a storm near the Greek island of Antikythera stumbled upon a shipwreck. That's the solid historical beginning. What they recovered from the seabed would quietly unsettle the timeline of technology. You hover over the wreck as if weightless amphorae scattered like forgotten chess pieces across the sand. Bronze statues lie in pieces, their once proud forms softened by corrosion. And then you see it, a lump of greenish metal, encrusted and unassuming. Hardly the stuff of legend. When it was first brought to the surface, no one realized what it was. Only later, as fragments were cleaned and examined, did gears reveal themselves. Dozens of finely cut bronze gears, interlocking with precise teeth. The Antikythera Mechanism, dated to around 100 BCE, is often described as the world's first analog computer. You turn it carefully in your hands, at least in imagination. Dials, inscriptions, tiny, meticulous craftsmanship, modern imaging techniques, X-ray tomography among them, have shown that it could predict eclipses, track lunar cycles and model planetary motions according to Greek astronomical knowledge of the time. That's the mainstream fact, astonishing enough on its own. Ancient Greeks, drawing on Babylonian observations and their own geometric models, constructed a mechanical device capable of simulating the heavens. You pause, because here's what unsettles you. Nothing else quite like it has been found from that period. No workshops full of similar machines. No gradual mechanical prototypes leading clearly up to it. It appears, at least in the archaeological record, suddenly sophisticated. Historians still argue whether the mechanism was a rare luxury item produced in limited numbers, or whether others existed but simply didn't survive. Bronze was valuable. Metal objects were often melted down and reused. If similar devices were dismantled for scrap over centuries, you'd never know. You brush imaginary sediment from the engraved Greek lettering, the names of months, references to games held in different regions. It wasn't merely astronomical, it was cultural, a handheld cosmos ticking quietly in someone's study. There's something deeply intimate about that. You imagine a scholar in the Hellenistic world, turning a small crank, watching miniature pointers glide across zodiac scales. No electricity, no glowing screen, just gears translating celestial motion into human comprehension. And yet the mechanism challenges your comfortable narrative of technological progress. You tend to imagine ancient technology as linear, simple machines gradually evolving into complexity. But here is complexity already thriving over 2,000 years ago, a quirky detail for you. One of the mechanism's dials likely tracked the Saros cycle, an 18-year period, after which eclipses repeat. Babylonian astronomers had identified this pattern centuries earlier. Knowledge flowing across cultures, accumulating like layers of sediment. The ancient world was more interconnected than you might casually assume. Still, the gaps remain. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, much technical knowledge in Europe fragmented, while the Byzantine and Islamic worlds preserved and expanded upon Greek science. Complex geared mechanisms of this sort largely disappear from the record until medieval astronomical clocks re-emerge, more than 1,000 years later. Historians still argue whether the Antikythera Mechanism represents a peak in a broader tradition of Hellenistic engineering now mostly lost, or a singular masterpiece built by an exceptional mind, perhaps inspired by Archimedes, who reportedly constructed mechanical models of the heavens. Imagine that, entire technological lineages erased not by dramatic cataclysm but by neglect, shifting priorities, economic collapse. You float slightly upward in the water, the wreck fading into blue haze. There are fringe whispers, of course. Some have dramatically labeled the mechanism evidence of lost advanced civilizations, suggesting knowledge far beyond what ancient Greeks could possess. But detailed study shows the device aligns with known Greek mathematical and astronomical theories. It doesn't require extraterrestrials or vanished supercultures. It requires brilliance and time. And that may be even more humbling, because brilliance existed long before modern industry, long before silicon chips and space telescopes. You are not the first to reduce the cosmos to calculations. You are not the first to crave prediction over chaos. You picture the moment the ship sank. A storm, perhaps? Wood splintering? Cargo shifting? The precious mechanism tumbling into darkness, swallowed by salt water for nearly 2 millennia. Had those sponge divers not anchored in the wrong place at the right time, you might never have known it existed. That thought lingers. How many other devices lie buried beneath cities, forests, oceans? Wood decays, iron rusts into nothing, even bronze corrodes into shapeless masses that look like debris. Without careful examination, they remain invisible to history. The Antikythera Mechanism survived by accident. You slowly rise toward the surface now, the water warming as sunlight returns. The ocean's skin shimmers above you like liquid glass. The device doesn't prove a forgotten global civilization. It doesn't rewrite evolution or overturn physics, but it does something subtler. It reminds you that human knowledge is not a straight staircase. It rises, it dips, it fragments, it reassembles. Somewhere, over 2,000 years ago, someone held a mechanical universe in their hands and understood the rhythm of eclipses decades in advance. And then the sea closed over it. Evidence doesn't always shout. Sometimes it ticks softly, gear against gear, waiting centuries for someone to listen. You break the surface into open air, lungs filling again, carrying with you the quiet realization that sophistication is not uniquely modern. It has surfaced before, and it may have sunk again. The ocean drains from your ears, replaced by the dry hush of a museum storage room. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, metal shelves stretch in quiet rows, lined with labeled boxes. History, carefully catalogued, or at least the parts of it that make sense. You slide open a drawer inside. Lies something small, unassuming. A nail perhaps, or a coin, or a fragment of worked metal. And yet the label beside it feels uncomfortable. Out of place. The term often used is UPART, out-of-place artifact. It sounds dramatic, like something you'd discover in a sci-fi film, while ominous music builds in the background. In reality, most such objects turn out to have fairly grounded explanations, but not all questions vanish immediately. Take the so-called London hammer, reportedly discovered in Texas in the 1930s, encased in rock that some claim is hundreds of millions of years old. At first glance, it appears to be an ordinary iron hammer partially embedded in limestone. Fringe theorists suggest it proves advanced human technology in deep prehistory. Mainstream geologists, however, explain that mineral concretions can form relatively quickly around modern objects under the right conditions. The surrounding rock is not necessarily as old as the broader geological formation. In other words, sometimes the Earth wraps things up like a gift without checking the calendar. You place the hammer back in its drawer. Historians still argue whether certain UPART claims persist because of genuine anomalies, or because they satisfy a desire for mystery in an otherwise methodical discipline. The human brain loves a plot twist. Then there are the Baghdad batteries, ceramic jars discovered near Baghdad in the 1930s, dating to the Parthian period, around 250 BCE to 250 CE. Each contains a copper cylinder and an iron rod. In the 20th century, some researchers proposed they might function as primitive galvanic cells, essentially ancient batteries. You imagine filling one with vinegar or grape juice generating a small electric current. Experiments have shown it's possible. Mainstream scholars remain cautious. There's no definitive evidence the jars were used to generate electricity. They may have served a more mundane purpose, like storing scrolls. Historians still argue whether the battery interpretation is ingenious insight or modern projection. Just because something can produce electricity doesn't mean it powered an ancient karaoke machine, though that would improve certain historical reenactments. You walk farther down the aisle. Here's a more grounded example. Aluminum artifacts found in contexts that puzzled early investigators. Aluminum requires complex electrochemical processes to refine. It wasn't widely produced until the 19th century, so when small aluminum objects turned up in older layers, it sparked curiosity. In nearly every well-documented case, contamination or later intrusion explained the anomaly. Layers of soil shift. Burrowing animals disturb strata. Human activity mixes timelines in subtle ways. Archaeology is less like reading a neat book and more like reconstructing shredded paperwork after a windstorm. Still, there are moments that genuinely stretch expectations. In South Africa, Tiny metallic spheres, sometimes called the Klerksdorp spheres, have been found in Precambrian rock formations over 2 billion years old. Some enthusiasts claim they are artificial objects manufactured by an ancient civilization. Geologists, however, identify them as naturally formed concretions of minerals like pyrite or hematite. Nature, it turns out, is surprisingly good at making things that look engineered. Symmetry doesn't always require intention. You pause and consider a broader truth. Context is everything. An object alone means little. It's the layer, the associated materials, the radiometric dating, the surrounding evidence that builds a case. When an artifact appears out of place, archaeologists first question the context before rewriting history. It's not stubbornness, it's caution. Historians still argue whether academic conservatism sometimes slows acceptance of paradigm-shifting discoveries. After all, the idea that humans reached the Americas earlier than 13,000 years ago was once dismissed, and now it's widely accepted. Science adjusts, but carefully. There's a quirky tidbit you might appreciate. In the 19th century, reports circulated of a mysterious cogwheel found in coal deposits, allegedly millions of years old. The story grew in retellings, often without physical evidence preserved for modern analysis. It became a kind of fossilized rumor, evidence of how easily narratives can harden without verification. You run your hand along the shelf. The deeper question isn't whether every strange artifact proves a forgotten advanced civilization. Most don't. The deeper question is how fragile the archaeological record really is. Imagine a modern city buried under sediment for 100,000 years. Steel rusts away, plastics degrade, concrete cracks and dissolves, electronics become unrecognizable mineral stains. Without context, your entire technological society might reduce to scattered alloys and puzzling shapes. Future archaeologists, if such beings exist, might debate whether a corroded smartphone was ceremonial or utilitarian. They might argue whether your microwave was a sacred box for offerings. To be fair, you do place things inside and wait reverently. The point settles gently. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is mystery evidence of miracles. You close another drawer. Some ooparts fade under scrutiny. Others remain mildly perplexing but not revolutionary. And a very small number genuinely challenge previous assumptions, not by proving lost super-civilizations, but by reminding you that knowledge can appear earlier than expected. The Antikythera Mechanism did that. So did early evidence of complex symbolic art. So did advanced urban planning in places once underestimated. Patterns emerge. Innovation isn't always gradual. Sometimes it blooms suddenly, at least from your limited vantage point. The record is incomplete, full of gaps where entire chapters may have dissolved. You switch off the fluorescent light in your imagination. The storage room returns to shadow, artifacts resting in labeled silence. Something was here before you. That part is undeniable. Whether it was exactly what you expect, whether it rose and fell in ways you haven't fully uncovered, that remains open. And somewhere in the quiet between certainty and speculation, history keeps a few drawers slightly ajar. The storage room fades and you find yourself seated beside a fire. Not a modern campfire with neatly stacked logs and a bag of marshmallows waiting patiently. This one crackles in open air beneath a sky so clear the stars look almost close enough to touch. Sparks drift upward, like tiny messengers, and across from you sits a figure whose face shifts with shadow, before cities, before maps, before bronze gears ticking in saltwater darkness. There were stories. You listen. In ancient Mesopotamia, long before written history settled into tidy king lists, the Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki, powerful beings associated with the heavens. In some interpretations, they were gods who shaped humanity, granting knowledge and structure. That's the mainstream historical fact. These figures appear in Sumerian mythology as deities connected to creation and cosmic order. But as centuries passed, reinterpretations layered themselves over the original texts. In the 20th century, fringe theorists proposed that the Anunnaki were not gods in a symbolic sense, but literal extraterrestrial visitors who engineered humanity. Most scholars firmly reject this interpretation, noting that the original cuneiform tablets describe mythological cosmology, not science fiction. Still, the fire pops and you feel the persistence of the idea, because Sumer isn't alone. In Mesoamerican traditions, the Aztecs told of Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent deity associated with wind, knowledge, and creation. Some myths describe him as a teacher who brought agriculture and calendars. In the Andes, Viracocha emerges from the sea, teaching civilization before departing across the water. Historians still argue whether these culture hero figures represent deified ancestors, mythologized rulers, or symbolic embodiments of natural forces. The interpretation varies, but the pattern repeats. Beings who arrive, teach, and leave, You stare into the flames and consider how easily memory transforms. Imagine a small group of technologically advanced travelers encountering a less complex society, even a modest gap in knowledge. Metal tools, astronomical understanding, architectural techniques could appear miraculous. Over generations, practical instruction could become divine intervention. That doesn't mean it happened. It means the human mind translates awe into narrative. There's a quirky detail from ancient Egypt you might appreciate. The god Thoth was credited with inventing writing, mathematics, and measurement. Rather than emerging gradually from collective human effort, knowledge is personified, handed down by a being who stands outside ordinary life. It's a poetic shortcut. Attribution through myth. Mainstream anthropology suggests that these stories reflect how societies process innovation. When agriculture replaces hunting, when writing reshapes communication, when cities rise from mud brick, such transformations feel monumental. Assigning them to gods frames them within meaning. Yet the similarities across continents are intriguing. In the Dogon traditions of Mali, there are stories about beings called the Nommo associated with the star Sirius. In the 20th century, some writers claimed the Dogon possessed advanced astronomical knowledge about Sirius B, a white dwarf star invisible to the naked eye. This fueled speculation about ancient extraterrestrial contact. Later research complicated that narrative. Scholars suggested that some of the astronomical details may have been influenced by modern contact with European researchers. Historians still argue whether the Dogon cosmology contained independently derived astronomical insights, or if the story evolved through cross-cultural exchange. You shift closer to the fire, warmth brushing your face. It's tempting to see a grand pattern, a forgotten global civilization sending emissaries across the world, seeding knowledge like cosmic gardeners. The idea is cinematic. It gives you a prequel to history. But human societies are remarkably inventive on their own. Agriculture arose independently in multiple regions: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes. Writing systems emerged separately in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and possibly Mesoamerica. Innovation doesn't require a single teacher descending from the sky. Sometimes it sprouts wherever conditions allow. Still, historians still argue whether certain technological leaps spread more widely and earlier than previously thought through trade networks you're only beginning to understand. The ancient world was not isolated villages frozen in time. It was a web of exchange, obsidian, shells, ideas moving across surprising distances. Here's a light thought to balance the cosmic speculation. If advanced sky beings truly visited Earth to enlighten humanity, you might expect them to leave clearer instruction manuals, perhaps laminated with diagrams. Instead, what you mostly have are poetic hymns and very dramatic weather events. The fire settles lower. You realize something deeper. The recurrence of first teachers in myth may not point to visitors from beyond, but to a shared human experience. Every child encounters the world through instruction. Parents, elders, mentors, knowledge is always received from someone older, someone who seems impossibly wise. Scale that feeling up to a civilization. The first astronomer who predicts an eclipse would seem supernatural. The first architect who aligns a temple with the solstice sunrise might appear divinely inspired. Over time, memory smooths rough edges, turning skilled humans into luminous figures. And yet, what if there were earlier waves of complexity that collapsed? Small regionally advanced societies erased by climate shifts or conflict. Survivors could carry fragments of knowledge elsewhere, where they seed new growth. Not aliens, not gods, just humans inheriting from humans whose names have vanished. The Younger Dryas event, an abrupt cooling period around 12,900 years ago, may have disrupted early human societies. You'll explore that more deeply later. But imagine communities experimenting with settled life before that climatic shock. Their structures, built from wood and mud, could vanish almost completely. What would remain? Stories. You look up at the stars. Every culture has tried to explain them. Constellations become hunters, serpents, queens, patterns imposed on chaos, meaning drawn from distance. The idea that something was here before you, guiding, teaching, influencing, may be less about literal beings and more about continuity. You are shaped by knowledge you didn't invent. You inherit language, mathematics, myths, architecture. Your entire world is a gift from predecessors you'll never meet. The fire dims further, embers glowing soft red. Whether the first teachers were gods, misunderstood travelers, brilliant ancestors, or symbolic archetypes, the message is the same. Knowledge did not begin with you. It arrived. It was passed down, and somewhere in the long relay of memory, pieces were dropped, transformed, forgotten, rediscovered. The night stretches wide above you, silent and patient. Someone before you looked at these same stars and felt the same mixture of wonder and uncertainty, and they told a story to make sense of it. The embers cool, and the night sky fades into something older still. You stand now in a vast open landscape where the wind carries the dry scent of dust and sun-warmed stone. At your feet lies a fragment of bone, pale against darker earth. It looks ordinary until you realize it doesn't quite fit the story you thought you knew. For much of the 20th century, human evolution was presented as a tidy progression. Australopithecus to Homo habilis, to Homo erectus to Neanderthals, and finally to you, Homo sapiens. A straight line, almost polite in its simplicity. Reality, of course, is messier. In 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a small-bodied hominin species later named Homo floresiensis, popularly nicknamed the Hobbit. These individuals stood about 3.5 feet tall and lived as recently as 50,000 to perhaps 100,000 years ago. That's the mainstream fact, supported by skeletal analysis and dating methods. You crouch beside the imagined skeleton. The skull is small, with a brain size closer to that of much earlier hominins. And yet, stone tools found nearby suggest behavioral complexity. This wasn't a simple evolutionary throwback wandering accidentally into the late Pleistocene. It was a branch of humanity surviving alongside others. Historians and paleoanthropologists still argue whether Homo floresiensis descended from Homo erectus and underwent island dwarfism, a phenomenon where limited resources drive smaller body size, or whether it represents a much earlier lineage that left Africa far sooner than previously believed. Either way, the neat ladder of progress collapses, and Flores isn't alone. In 2010, genetic analysis of a finger bone from Denisova cave in Siberia revealed an entirely new group, the Denisovans. Before that, you had no idea they existed. No clear skeletal framework displayed in museums, just DNA whispering from ancient remains. Mainstream science now accepts that Denisovans interbred with modern humans. If you have ancestry from parts of Asia or Oceania, you may carry a small percentage of Denisovan DNA. It's not science fiction. It's written into your cells. You pause. Something was here before you, and not just metaphorically. Other human species walked this planet. Neanderthals, Denisovans, Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, not sequentially replacing one another like actors exiting stage left, but overlapping, interacting. Historians still argue whether Neanderthals disappeared primarily due to climate stress, competition with Homo sapiens, assimilation through interbreeding, or a combination of all three. The answer may never be singular. You imagine standing in Ice Age Europe 40,000 years ago. In the distance, smoke rises from another campfire. The figures around it are not quite like you, stockier, broader-faced, but unmistakably human. Would you recognize each other as kin? There's a quirky detail that feels almost intimate. Modern genetic studies suggest that some immune system traits in present-day humans were inherited from Neanderthals. Their ancient adaptations still help you resist certain pathogens. You carry their survival strategies quietly, invisibly. And yet, fossils sometimes appear where they're least expected. Homo naledi, discovered in South Africa in 2013 within the Rising Star cave system, displayed a curious mix of primitive and modern features. Its brain size was small, yet aspects of its anatomy suggested more advanced capabilities. Some researchers even proposed the possibility of deliberate body disposal in the cave, an early form of ritual behavior. Historians still argue whether the dating of Homo naledi, now estimated between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago, forces a re-evaluation of how cognitive complexity correlates with brain size. Bigger isn't always smarter, apparently, a comforting thought for anyone who's ever misplaced their keys. The deeper you look into the fossil record, the less linear it becomes. Instead of a single path, you see a braided stream, multiple lineages diverging, converging, sometimes disappearing entirely. Evolution experiments, some successful for hundreds of thousands of years, then gone. And here's where it grows quietly unsettling. Fossilization is rare. It requires specific conditions, rapid burial, low oxygen, mineral-rich water. Most organisms leave nothing behind. Entire populations could exist and vanish without a trace in stone. Historians still argue how incomplete your fossil record truly is. For every species identified, how many remain undiscovered? How many left no skeletal evidence at all? You imagine a small hominin group living in a region where acidic soil dissolves bone. They hunt, craft tools, tell stories, then climate shifts. They move or perish. Within a few thousand years, physical evidence of their existence fades entirely, except perhaps in your DNA. Genetic studies have revealed ghost populations, ancient hominins inferred from unusual DNA patterns in modern humans, even though no confirmed fossils have yet been found. Their bones may still lie hidden, or may have vanished completely. You feel a subtle shift inside. The question is no longer whether something was here before you. it's how many somethings. You are not the sole inheritor of humanity's experiment. You are a composite, a mosaic of ancient lineages braided together through encounters that left no written record. And think about what that implies. If multiple human species coexisted within the last 50,000 years, a blink in geological time, then intelligence, culture, and innovation were not exclusive traits of a single line. They were shared, varied, perhaps expressed differently. What stories did Denisovans tell beneath Siberian skies? What art might Neanderthals have made beyond the few cave markings now attributed to them? Some recent discoveries suggest Neanderthals created symbolic cave art in Spain over 60,000 years ago, before modern humans arrived in that region. Historians still argue whether those markings were definitively Neanderthal-made, but the evidence is growing. You straighten up, wind brushing across open terrain once more. The narrative of human uniqueness softens. You are part of a much broader tapestry, threads woven long before your species fully emerged. And if multiple intelligent hominin groups once shared this planet, overlapping and interacting, then the idea that something was here before us stops being speculative. It becomes biological. It becomes personal. You carry echoes of them in your blood, fragments of their adaptations in your immune system. Perhaps even subtle influences on how your brain processes the world. The wind continues, indifferent and steady. You are not the first to stand upright beneath this sky. You are the latest. And somewhere beneath layers of sediment and time, bones still wait, quiet evidence that the story of who was here before you is far from complete. The wind fades into a low, muffled hum. You're descending again, but not into blue Mediterranean water this time. This water is murkier, greener, threaded with shafts of light that dissolve a few meters below the surface. Your ears fill with the soft pressure of depth as you drift downward toward shapes that don't belong to coral or reef. Stone, straight lines beneath waves. Sea levels today feel permanent to you, as if coastlines have always traced their current edges. But during the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were more than 100 meters lower than they are now. That's the mainstream geological fact. Vast areas that are currently seabed were once dry land. River valleys, plains, perhaps even settlements. You level out above a submerged terrace near Yonaguni, off the coast of Japan. Discovered in 1986 by a diver searching for hammerhead sharks, the Yonaguni monument features massive stone formations with sharp angles and step-like structures. Some observers insist it's the remains of a lost city. Others see natural sandstone formations, shaped by tectonic activity and erosion. Historians and geologists still argue whether Yonaguni is primarily natural with minimal human modification, or whether parts of it were deliberately shaped. The debate continues, measured and cautious. You hover over a broad platform, its edges crisp in the filtered light. Nature is surprisingly good at producing right angles under the right stresses, but your brain is wired to detect patterns, especially architectural ones. You see stairs where water and time may have carved ledges. It's a reminder. Perception is powerful. Now you drift west across oceans toward the coast of India. In 2001, sonar scans in the Gulf of Kambat revealed geometric anomalies beneath the water, grid-like patterns that some researchers suggested might be remnants of an ancient settlement. Early excitement led to claims of a 9,000-year-old city predating the Indus Valley civilization. Further investigation complicated those claims. Artifacts recovered were difficult to conclusively link to man-made structures in situ. Historians still argue whether the site represents genuine submerged ruins or geological formations misinterpreted through sonar imaging. The ocean is not a tidy archive. Currents move objects, sediment shifts, context blurs, and yet the possibility remains deeply plausible. Coastal settlements would have been prime real estate for ancient humans. Access to fish, transport routes, fertile deltas. When ice sheets melted and seas rose rapidly between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, many of those early coastal zones disappeared beneath encroaching water. You imagine a small settlement near what is now the North Sea, families building with wood and thatch, tools of bone and flint. Then, over generations, the shoreline creeps closer. Storm surges grow stronger. Eventually, the sea claims the land entirely. Structures collapse, wood rots, only stone tools scatter across a drowned plain. In fact, such a place existed, Doggerland. Once a vast stretch connecting Britain to mainland Europe, it was gradually submerged after the last ice age. Fishermen have dredged up mammoth bones, stone tools, even fragments of peat from its depths. Mainstream archaeology recognizes Doggerland as a real inhabited landscape now lost to the sea. You glide lower, fingertips brushing sediment, off the coast of Cuba. In 2001, a Canadian exploration team reported sonar images suggesting symmetrical stone formations at great depth. Some speculated about a submerged city. The depth, over 600 meters, would imply extraordinary antiquity if human-built. However, limited follow-up data and lack of peer-reviewed confirmation have left the claim unresolved. Historians still argue whether the formations are natural geology or something more structured. The deeper you go, the less certain everything feels. Here's a quirky but grounded detail. Ancient Mediterranean ports like Heraklion, also called Thonis, near Egypt, were once thriving trade hubs before subsiding and sinking beneath the sea around 1,200 years ago. Rediscovered in 2000, Heraklion revealed statues, temples, and ships preserved in silt. This isn't fringe speculation. It's documented archaeology. Cities can sink. Earthquakes, subsidence, rising seas. Entire urban landscapes slip quietly below the waterline. If that can happen in recorded history, how much more could have vanished in prehistoric times? You pause, suspended in green dimness. The Younger Dryas period, beginning around 12,900 years ago, brought abrupt climate shifts. Some researchers propose that rapid meltwater pulses cause sudden sea level rise events. While the exact pace and regional impacts are still debated, it's clear that coastlines transformed dramatically within human timescales. Historians still argue how advanced coastal communities may have been at that time. Were they small bands of foragers, or were some experimenting with more permanent settlements that left little durable trace? You imagine standing on a shoreline 11,000 years ago, watching water swallow land your grandparents once walked. You retreat inland, carrying memory and perhaps stories of a drowned homeland. Over generations, the tale becomes myth. An island lost, a great flood. Nearly every culture carries flood narratives. Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh, the biblical account of Noah, stories from indigenous Australian traditions describing rising seas. Scholars generally interpret these as cultural memories of localized flooding events, rather than evidence of a single global deluge. But the emotional truth remains. Water erases. The ocean floor is vast and largely unexplored. Marine archaeology is expensive and technically challenging. For every Heraklion rediscovered, countless other sites may remain buried under meters of sediment. You rise slowly, light strengthening as you ascend. Something was here before you, not just inland cities swallowed by sand, but shorelines teeming with life now hidden beneath waves. Evidence exists, but it's scattered, fragmented, distorted by currents and time. The sea does not preserve gently. It abrades, corrodes, disperses, and yet sometimes it guards. You break the surface once more, horizon stretching wide and deceptively calm. Beneath you lie plains that once felt solid under human feet, fires once burned there, voices once carried across air that is now replaced by saltwater silence. If an earlier chapter of complexity existed primarily along ancient coasts, much of it would now rest out of sight. Not gone, just drowned. The ocean smooths into stillness, and as you drift on its surface, the sky above you begins to change. Not gradually, abruptly, the air sharpens. The temperature dips in a way that feels wrong for the season. Wind patterns shift. It's subtle at first, just a whisper of instability, but then the world lurches. Around 12,900 years ago, near the end of the last ice age, Earth plunged back into near-glacial conditions after a period of warming. This sudden reversal is known as the Younger Dryas. That's the mainstream fact, supported by ice core data from Greenland showing a dramatic temperature drop, possibly as much as 10 degrees Celsius in some regions within decades. You imagine living through that. One generation hunts in relatively temperate landscapes. The next faces advancing cold, altered rainfall, shifting animal migrations. It wouldn't feel like a slow geological drift. It would feel like the rules of the world had changed overnight. The leading explanation for the Younger Dryas involves disruptions to ocean circulation, specifically a massive influx of fresh water from melting ice sheets into the North Atlantic, potentially slowing the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. In simpler terms, the planet's heat conveyor belt hiccuped. But there's another hypothesis. Some researchers have proposed that a comet or fragmented asteroid impact around that time triggered widespread fires and atmospheric effects that contributed to the cooling. Tiny spherical particles called microspherules, along with nanodiamonds found at certain archaeological sites, have been cited as possible evidence. Historians and geologists still argue whether the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis holds up under scrutiny. Some studies support unusual impact-related materials, others fail to replicate those findings. The debate is ongoing, measured, technical, unresolved. You stand now on a late Pleistocene plain. Mammoths roam in the distance. Giant ground sloths lumber near sparse trees. Human groups, Clovis culture in North America for example, craft finely fluted spear points. Then something changes. In North America, many large megafauna species disappear around the same general time frame. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats. Mainstream explanations include a combination of climate stress and human overhunting. Historians still argue about the relative weight of each factor. But if you lived through that era, you wouldn't have access to peer-reviewed journals. You'd see animals thinning out, weather turning erratic, resources shifting, and perhaps if a cosmic event occurred, you'd witness something far more dramatic. Imagine a bright streak across the sky, a thunderous detonation, shockwaves fires igniting across dry grasslands. Even a regional airburst event, like a much larger version of the 108 Tunguska explosion in Siberia, could devastate wide areas without leaving a classic crater. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis remains controversial. Many scientists remain unconvinced, yet the persistence of the debate reveals something important. Earth's climate system can change rapidly, with or without extraterrestrial assistance, and rapid change disrupts civilizations, especially those in early stages of settlement. You walk across a landscape dotted with temporary dwellings. Some human groups near the end of the Ice Age were beginning to experiment with more permanent camps. Semi-sedentary communities in the Levant, such as the Natufians, had begun building stone structures before fully transitioning to agriculture. Then the Younger Dryas cooling may have forced adaptation. Some researchers suggest that climatic stress encouraged the development of agriculture as a more controlled food source. Others caution against overly simple cause and effect narratives. Historians still argue whether the Younger Dryas acted as a catalyst for agriculture or merely coincided with ongoing experimentation. Here's a grounded but fascinating detail. Ice cores from Greenland preserve annual layers like tree rings, trapping tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere. By analyzing isotopes within those layers, scientists can reconstruct temperature shifts with remarkable precision. The Younger Dryas signal is unmistakable. A sharp dip, then a sharp rise around 11,700 years ago, marking the beginning of the stable Holocene epoch in which you now live. Stable is relative, of course. You feel the cold ease as the Holocene begins. Temperatures stabilize, glaciers retreat, forests spread, sea levels continue rising. It's during this stable window that agriculture flourishes in multiple regions. But here's the haunting possibility. If any early complex settlements existed before or during the Younger Dryas, particularly along coastlines, they may have been doubly vulnerable. First to climate shock, then to rising seas as the planet warmed again. Wooden structures would rot, mud brick would dissolve, stone foundations might remain, but submerged or buried, you pause and look at the sky. Catastrophe doesn't require science fiction, it requires fragility. Modern civilization depends on stable climate patterns, predictable seasons, manageable sea levels. A shift of even a few degrees globally can ripple through food systems and infrastructure. Now imagine such a shift hitting small early communities with limited storage and mobility. The archaeological record shows resilience. Humans adapted, they survived, they innovated. But survival doesn't mean continuity of every idea. Knowledge can vanish if the people carrying it disperse or perish. A technique known by a small group can disappear in a single harsh winter. You brush frost from your sleeve in this imagined landscape. The Younger Dryas ended as abruptly as it began. Temperatures rose sharply. The Holocene ushered in 11,700 years of relative climatic stability, a rare calm in Earth's volatile history. And during that calm, cities rose, agriculture spread, writing emerged, pyramids were built, gears ticked in bronze mechanisms. But what if the calm followed a reset? Not a global wipe of advanced skyscrapers and satellites, but perhaps the disruption of smaller, regionally complex experiments in settlement that left only faint traces. Historians still argue whether you are underestimating how sophisticated late Pleistocene societies might have been, or overestimating based on limited data. The wind steadies, the cold recedes. You stand now at the threshold of the Holocene, the epoch that feels like home. Behind you lies a period of abrupt change. Ahead lies the rise of everything you recognize as civilization. If something was here before you, before your recorded history, it may have faced forces beyond its control. Climate does not negotiate. The sky clears, stars emerging once more. And you can't help but wonder, how many beginnings were interrupted before the one that led to you finally took hold? The cold recedes fully now, and the air grows warmer, steadier, gentler in a way that feels almost intentional. You walk across a low ridge in southeastern Turkey, the soil beneath your feet dry and pale. In the distance, circular stone enclosures rise from the earth, like the ribs of something ancient and half-buried. Göbekli Tepe, discovered in the 1990s by German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt. This site dates back to around 9600 BCE, over 11,000 years ago. That's the mainstream fact, confirmed by radiocarbon dating of organic material found within the site's layers. It predates Stonehenge by about 6,000 years. It predates the Great Pyramids by roughly 7,000. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it predates agriculture. You step closer to one of the massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons. They're arranged in circular formations, each enclosure ringed by smaller stones and anchored by two towering central pillars. Carved into their surfaces are reliefs of animals: foxes, snakes, wild boars, vultures rendered with confident lines. Hunter-gatherers built this. That statement still feels strange even to archaeologists. For decades, the prevailing model suggested that agriculture led to settled life, which led to surplus food, which enabled monumental construction and organized religion. Göbekli Tepe complicates that tidy sequence. Here you have monumental architecture before clear evidence of domesticated crops in the region. Historians still argue whether Göbekli Tepe represents a ceremonial center built by mobile hunter-gatherer groups who gathered seasonally, or whether it hints at early forms of social organization, more complex than previously assumed for that era. You run your fingers along a carved fox, its body stretched in profile. The craftsmanship is deliberate. These weren't random scratches. Someone invested time, skill, and intention into shaping stone with stone tools. And here's a grounded but astonishing detail. After centuries of use, the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were intentionally buried by the very people who built them. Tons of soil and debris were packed in, preserving the structures beneath. Intentionally buried. You pause with that. It wasn't erosion. It wasn't collapse. It was deliberate. Historians still argue why. Was it ritual closure? A shift in belief systems? A practical move to build a new nearby? The motive remains uncertain. You imagine the labor involved. Groups hauling limestone from nearby quarries using only stone tools and coordinated effort. No metal, no draft animals, no wheeled carts, just muscle, rope, and will. There's a quirky thought that might make you smile. Archaeologists found large quantities of animal bones at the site, suggesting feasting events, massive communal meals. You can almost picture it. Ancient project managers motivating workers with roasted gazelle and fermented beverages, civilization's first catering service. But beneath the humor lies something profound. Göbekli Tepe implies that symbolic or ritual motivation may have preceded, and perhaps even driven, the adoption of agriculture, instead of farming enabling temples. Perhaps temples encouraged farming. If people gathered regularly in one place for ceremonial reasons, they may have needed more reliable food sources nearby. The direction of causality shifts. You stand at the center of one enclosure, looking up at twin pillars silhouetted against open sky. Some researchers suggest the T-shapes represent stylized human forms, abstracted bodies with arms carved along the sides. If so, these aren't just pillars, they're presences. And yet, there's no evidence of domestic structures directly within the main excavated areas. No hearths for daily cooking, no clear signs of permanent habitation at the core site. It feels set apart. Historians still argue whether Göbekli Tepe was a singular phenomenon or part of a broader network of similar sites in the region. Nearby locations like Karahan Tepe suggest it may not have been alone, which raises a question you can't quite ignore. If monumental construction and complex symbolic systems existed before agriculture, how many other early centers might remain undiscovered or buried beneath later settlements? Remember how fragile the record is. Wood decays, mud brick dissolves, only stone lingers. You imagine similar sites built primarily from timber, sacred enclosures marked by carved posts, gathering spaces that left almost no trace after millennia of weather. Göbekli Tepe survived in part because it was buried deliberately, hidden, preserved like a time capsule. Without that burial, you might never have known it existed. You walk slowly around the circular enclosure, noticing how the carvings face inward, toward the center. The design feels intentional, even theatrical, and here's where speculation tempts you. Some alternative thinkers propose that Göbekli Tepe is a remnant of a much older, lost civilization that survived the Younger Dryas catastrophe and preserved fragments of knowledge. Mainstream archaeology, however, sees it as the product of increasingly complex hunter-gatherer societies at the dawn of the Holocene. No lost high-tech empire required, just human ingenuity emerging in ways that challenge your assumptions. But assumptions matter. Before Göbekli Tepe's excavation, few imagined that pre-agricultural societies could coordinate labor at such scale. Now the evidence stands in limestone silence. Historians still argue whether your model of social complexity has been too narrow, whether ritual, belief, and shared identity were powerful enough forces to mobilize massive collective effort long before written language. You step back and take in the entire site. Something was here before your familiar story of civilization began. Not skyscrapers, not metal machines, but organized, symbolic, intentional construction that predates the textbook sequence. It suggests that the spark of complexity flickered earlier than expected. And if one site lay hidden for over 10,000 years until a farmer noticed oddly shaped stones in his field, how many others wait beneath soil across the world? The sun dips lower, casting long shadows between pillars. Göbekli Tepe doesn't scream of aliens or forgotten global empires. It whispers something subtler. You have underestimated your ancestors. And perhaps in doing so you have underestimated how many beginnings the world has already seen. The pillars fade behind you, but the sky remains. You tilt your head back, and for a moment there is no ground, no stone, no buried enclosure, only stars scattered across velvet darkness. They look random at first, like spilled salt, but the longer you stare, the more patterns emerge. A hunter, a scorpion, a swan stretching its wings. You are not the first to draw lines between distant lights. Long before telescopes, before glass lenses and polished mirrors, ancient people tracked the heavens with startling precision. That's the mainstream truth. At Stonehenge in England, constructed in stages beginning around 3000 BCE, the stones align with the sunrise of the summer solstice and the sunset of the winter solstice. You can still stand there today and watch the sun rise over the heel stone in late June, just as Neolithic observers once did. No metal observatory domes, no digital readouts, just careful observation over generations. Historians still argue whether Stonehenge functioned primarily as an astronomical calendar, a ceremonial site, a burial ground, or some layered combination of all three. The alignment is undeniable. The purpose remains debated. You imagine standing in the chill of dawn, waiting for the sun to crest exactly where you expect it. That moment would feel powerful. Predictive knowledge is a kind of magic, and Stonehenge isn't alone. In Mesoamerica, the Maya developed extraordinarily sophisticated astronomical systems. By the Classic period around 250 to 900 CE, they were calculating planetary cycles, especially that of Venus, with remarkable accuracy. The Dresden Codex contains detailed eclipse tables and Venus cycle data. That's firmly documented. You picture a Maya priest astronomer watching the sky from a stepped pyramid, tracking the heliacal rising of Venus, not for idle curiosity, but for ritual timing, agricultural planning, political symbolism. Historians still argue how the Maya achieved such precision without optical instruments beyond the naked eye and simple sighting tools. The answer likely lies in systematic multi-generational record-keeping, patience as technology. You turn slowly beneath the stars. In ancient Egypt, the Great Pyramid shafts are often cited for their possible alignment with certain stars, such as Orion's belt and Sirius, around the time of its construction. The Orion correlation theory suggests that the layout of the three main pyramids at Giza mirrors the pattern of Orion's belt. Most Egyptologists remain skeptical of strict one-to-one celestial mapping claims, arguing that the evidence for intentional large-scale star replication is not conclusive. Historians still argue whether the correlations are meaningful design or pattern-seeking imposed after the fact. Your brain loves symmetry. It finds faces in clouds and constellations in chaos. Yet some alignments are undeniably intentional. At Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, ancestral Puebloan structures built between 900 and 1150 CE include architectural alignments with solar and lunar cycles. The sun dagger petroglyph marks solstices and equinoxes with precise shafts of light cutting across carved spirals. You imagine standing inside a stone structure as a thin beam of sunlight slides across a spiral carving exactly once a year. It's subtle, elegant, intentional. Historians still argue whether such sites were primarily ceremonial centers, trade hubs, or astronomical observatories integrated into daily life. Likely they were all at once. And then there's Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, stone circles dating back to around 6000 to 7000 BCE. Some researchers suggest alignments with solstitial sunrise positions. If accurate, this would push organized astronomical observation far earlier than many once assumed. Again, debate lingers. Alignment claims require statistical rigor. Not every cluster of stones marks the cosmos. Sometimes rocks are simply rocks in enthusiastic arrangements. Here's a quirky but grounded detail. Polynesian navigators crossed vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean using star paths memorized over lifetimes. They knew which stars rose and set at specific points on the horizon, guiding voyages across thousands of miles without compasses. That knowledge wasn't written, it was embodied. You feel a quiet respect for that. The sky becomes a map, and maps, as you've seen, are evidence of perception structured over time. Some fringe interpretations go further. They suggest that certain ancient sites encode advanced astronomical data, precession of the equinoxes, long-term star shifts, implying knowledge far older than the structures themselves. Precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis over roughly 26,000 years, does shift the position of stars relative to the seasons. Ancient Greek astronomer Hipparchus is credited with formally discovering precession around 130 BCE. Historians still argue whether earlier cultures recognized precessional movement in a systematic way, or whether later observers retroactively projected that knowledge onto older monuments. You sit on cool ground and trace Orion in the air. The deeper truth may be simpler and more profound. The sky changes slowly, but perceptibly, across generations. A careful observer might notice that a star no longer rises exactly where their grandparents described. Over centuries, patterns drift. If your culture values celestial observation for agriculture, ritual, navigation, you will notice. No alien observatories required. But here's the quiet twist. Astronomy demands continuity. You cannot track long cycles in a single lifetime. You need records, oral or written, preserved carefully across generations. That means stability, community, intentional knowledge transfer. If something disrupted that continuity, climate shock, migration, conflict, the record could fragment. Observations lost, cycles forgotten, only fragments surviving in myth. You think back to Göbekli Tepe, to carved animals under open sky. Did those builders watch specific stars rise over their enclosures? Some researchers have proposed astronomical interpretations of certain carvings, suggesting possible comet imagery or constellation symbolism. Historians still argue whether those interpretations stretch beyond solid evidence. The stars wheel slowly overhead. You realize that ancient skywatchers were not naive. They were attentive, patient, invested in patterns that outlived individuals. Something was here before you, not just bodies and bones, but minds capable of modeling celestial rhythms without modern tools. You glance at the night one last time. The constellations you recognize are cultural overlays on distant suns. Others before you saw different shapes in the same stars, but they saw, they measured, they remembered, and in stone circles and pyramids and desert carvings, they left subtle markers aligned, not just with Earth, but with the sky itself. Evidence written in shadow and light. The stars dim above you, not because they vanish, but because something colder presses in. You stand now on an expanse of white so vast it feels abstract, an endless sheet of ice stretching toward a horizon blurred by wind. Antarctica, Greenland, it hardly matters which in your imagination, both hold the same quiet archive beneath their frozen surfaces. Ice remembers. Layer by layer, year after year, snowfall compresses into ice, trapping tiny bubbles of ancient atmosphere. These bubbles are time capsules. When scientists drill deep ice cores, cylinders extracted from kilometers below the surface, they're not just collecting frozen water. They're collecting air breathed by mammoths, by Neanderthals, by the earliest farmers. That's the mainstream fact. Ice cores allow researchers to reconstruct past temperatures and atmospheric composition, going back hundreds of thousands of years. The Vostok ice core in Antarctica, for example, reaches back over 400,000 years. The Epica core extends even further, around 800,000 years. You kneel and touch the ice, imagining each layer as a page in a book written by snowfall. The ratio of oxygen isotopes in the ice reveals temperature shifts. Trapped carbon dioxide levels tell you about greenhouse gas concentrations. Volcanic eruptions leave behind thin layers of ash, subtle scars in the frozen record. And sometimes the story turns abrupt. You already encountered the Younger Dryas in Greenland's ice, a sharp temperature drop visible in isotope ratios. But that's not the only jolt in the system. Ice cores reveal multiple rapid climate fluctuations, Dansgaard-Oeschger events during the last glacial period, temperature swings of several degrees occurring within decades. You picture ancient humans adjusting to landscapes that transformed within a single lifetime. Forests retracting, grasslands spreading, rainfall patterns shifting unpredictably. Historians still argue how deeply these abrupt shifts affected human cultural development. Did they accelerate innovation, trigger migrations, collapse fragile settlements before they could stabilize? You lean closer to a translucent slice of imagined core. Tiny dark specks are embedded within microscopic debris from distant volcanic eruptions. One particularly thick layer corresponds to the Toba supereruption around 74,000 years ago. Toba, located in present-day Indonesia, was one of the largest volcanic eruptions in the last 2 million years. Some researchers once proposed that Toba caused a volcanic winter severe enough to nearly wipe out early Homo sapiens, creating a genetic bottleneck. That hypothesis remains debated. Genetic evidence suggests a bottleneck occurred in human history, but whether Toba alone caused it is uncertain. Historians and scientists still argue whether the climatic impact of Toba was globally catastrophic or more regionally varied than early models suggested. You imagine ash dimming the sky, crops, if any existed then, failing, animal populations stressed, survival narrowing to pockets of resilience. Ice cores also capture evidence of massive wildfires. Elevated soot concentrations indicate periods when landscapes burned intensely. Some coincide with known climatic shifts, others remain less clearly understood. Here's a quirky but real detail. Trapped air bubbles in ice cores allow scientists to measure ancient methane levels, sometimes revealing spikes that correspond to expanding wetlands or, later in history, to early rice agriculture. Even your ancestors' farming habits leave chemical fingerprints in ice, thousands of miles away. You smile faintly at that thought. Humanity whispering into glaciers, but the deeper you drill, the more humbling the pattern becomes. Climate has never been perfectly stable. The Holocene, the relatively calm epoch beginning around 11,700 years ago, feels steady compared to the wild oscillations before it. But even within the Holocene, there are fluctuations. The 8.2 kiloyear event, a sudden cooling episode, the medieval warm period, the Little Ice Age. Civilizations rose and fell within these subtler waves. Historians still argue how much climate influenced events like the collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2200 BCE, possibly linked to prolonged drought, or the decline of the classic Maya civilization amid regional climate stress. You run your gloved hand across wind-scoured ice. Now imagine going further back, before written records, before stone cities, when human populations were smaller and more dispersed. A severe climatic shift then might erase entire regional cultures with minimal trace. Wooden dwellings rot, oral histories vanish with their speakers, stone tools scatter and blend with others. The ice would remember, but you would not. There's another layer of quiet intrigue. Some researchers studying ice cores have identified spikes in nitrate and ammonium concentrations that may correspond to solar storms or even cosmic events. These signals are subtle and often contested. Historians still argue whether certain chemical anomalies in ice cores reflect extraterrestrial impacts, solar variability, or terrestrial processes. The record is precise, but interpretation requires caution. You stand upright, wind tugging at your coat. Ice cores do not show evidence of a lost high-tech global civilization burning fossil fuels 50,000 years ago. If such a civilization had existed at industrial scale, atmospheric carbon signatures would likely reveal it. So far they do not. And yet the absence of industrial traces doesn't exclude smaller-scale complexity. Pre-industrial societies could flourish and vanish without leaving dramatic atmospheric fingerprints. You think about coastal settlements now submerged, about ritual centers buried deliberately, about hominin species known only from a fragment of bone. The ice tells you about temperature and gas concentrations. It tells you about volcanoes and dust storms. It does not tell you about every story spoken beneath changing skies. A gust sweeps across the plain, lifting fine crystals into the air like glittering static. Beneath kilometers of frozen accumulation lies a layered chronicle of Earth's instability and resilience. Something was here before you, not just once, but repeatedly. Groups of humans navigating fluctuating climates, adapting, migrating, innovating. Some may have reached surprising levels of organization before being disrupted by forces recorded only as isotope ratios in ice. Historians still argue how much complexity you've overlooked in deep prehistory. The evidence is fragmentary, filtered through geology and chemistry. You look down at the frozen ground beneath your boots. Every layer is a year, every meter, centuries, every kilometer, epochs. The planet has endured shocks that would feel apocalyptic to you, yet life persists. Civilizations are brief flickers against that scale. The wind softens. You're standing atop a frozen library written in snowfall, one that confirms abrupt change as a constant companion to human existence. If earlier chapters of complexity existed, they would have faced these same atmospheric shifts, and the ice, silent, patient, would have watched them come and go. The wind over the ice quiets, and the white horizon dissolves into something far more intimate. You are no longer scanning landscapes or pillars or drowned coastlines. You are looking inward. Inside nearly every cell of your body coils a molecule so small you will never see it directly. DNA, a spiraling archive written in 4 chemical letters. It carries instructions for building you, yes, but it also carries echoes of those who came long before. For most of modern history, you assumed your lineage was relatively straightforward. Homo sapiens emerging in Africa around 300,000 years ago, eventually spreading outward and replacing other hominins replaces a tidy word. It turns out to be incomplete. In 2010, when scientists sequenced the Neanderthal genome from fossil remains, they made a quiet but profound discovery. Non-African modern humans carry about 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. That's the mainstream fact, replicated and refined through multiple studies. You are not just descended from Homo sapiens. If your ancestry traces to Europe or Asia, you likely carry fragments of Neanderthal code, tiny sequences woven into your chromosomes, traits influencing immune response, skin physiology, even susceptibility to certain conditions have been linked to these inherited segments. Something was here before you, and it didn't vanish cleanly. You imagine two groups meeting on a windswept Pleistocene plain, not as caricatures, no dramatic music swelling, but as cautious, curious beings sharing overlapping territories. Exchanges happen. Over generations, genes mingle. Historians and geneticists still argue about the frequency and social context of such interactions. Were they rare events or relatively common? Peaceful integration or tense encounters that nonetheless resulted in shared offspring? The DNA confirms interbreeding occurred. The details remain opaque, and Neanderthals are not the only contributors. The Denisovans, identified first from a finger bone and a few teeth in Siberia, left genetic traces primarily in populations from Melanesia, Papua New Guinea, and parts of Southeast Asia. Some individuals carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA. Even more intriguing, certain high-altitude adaptations in Tibetan populations, specifically related to oxygen processing, appear linked to Denisovan ancestry, a survival advantage inherited from a group you have never seen reconstructed in full skeletal form. You pause with that. An entire lineage known more from genetic echoes than complete fossils has influenced how modern humans thrive in extreme environments. Historians still argue how many additional ghost populations may be hidden in your genome. Ancient hominins inferred from unusual DNA patterns but not yet matched to clear fossil records. In parts of Africa, genetic analyses suggest introgression from unknown archaic hominins. Not Neanderthals, not Denisovans, something else, something unnamed. You feel a subtle shift in perspective. Evolution is not a straight march, but a braided river. Lineages diverge, reconnect, merge, disappear. Here's a quirky but grounded detail. Some Neanderthal-derived genetic variants are associated with heightened sensitivity to pain. Others may influence circadian rhythms. In a strange way, your tolerance for discomfort or your tendency to stay up too late might carry faint ancestral fingerprints. Blame your sleep schedule on the Pleistocene. It sounds more impressive. But the deeper implication is this: extinction is not always erasure. Neanderthals disappeared as a distinct population around 40,000 years ago, yet parts of them persist in you. Historians still argue why Neanderthals declined. Climate volatility, competition with Homo sapiens, lower population densities making them vulnerable to demographic collapse. Disease exchange, perhaps a combination. The genetic evidence suggests assimilation played a role. Not conquest alone, but blending. You step back and imagine the human family tree not as a tree at all, but as an intricate web. Branches crossing, reconnecting, sometimes looping back. And then there's mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed almost exclusively through maternal lines. Studies tracing mitochondrial haplogroups allow scientists to reconstruct migration patterns across tens of thousands of years. The concept of mitochondrial Eve refers to the most recent common matrilineal ancestor of all living humans, who lived roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago in Africa. She was not the only woman alive then. She is simply the one whose maternal line did not break. That detail matters. History survives through continuity, not exclusivity. Now consider this. If small, regionally complex societies existed deep in prehistory and later fragmented, or merged into expanding Homo sapiens populations, their cultural identities might vanish. But their genes could persist. You would carry biological evidence of people whose names, languages, and traditions are entirely lost. Historians still argue how much cultural exchange accompanied genetic exchange. Did Neanderthals adopt certain tool-making techniques from modern humans, or vice versa? Some archaeological sites suggest overlapping technologies that blur neat distinctions, and here's something almost poetic. A few Neanderthal cave paintings in Spain have been dated to over 60,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens arrived in that region. If accurate, that suggests symbolic expression was not uniquely yours. Art was shared, you inhale slowly. The narrative of us versus them dissolves under genomic scrutiny. You are composite, hybrid, a living mosaic of ancient encounters. If something was here before you, it is not only buried in sediment or submerged beneath waves, it is encoded in your cells. And yet, the genome has limits. DNA degrades over time. Beyond certain thresholds, hundreds of thousands to a few million years, retrievable genetic material becomes vanishingly rare under most conditions. That means earlier hominin experiments may be permanently lost at the molecular level. Historians and geneticists still argue how far back ancient DNA can realistically reach, and whether new technologies might one day recover older sequences from sediments rather than bones. Even now, researchers can extract traces of hominin DNA from cave dirt, no visible bones required. The earth itself holds genetic whispers. You stand quietly with that thought. The soil beneath your feet may contain molecular fragments of individuals who left no recognizable skeleton behind. Evidence does not always shout. Sometimes it hides in spirals smaller than dust, waiting for tools precise enough to read them. You place a hand over your chest. Your heartbeat is your own. But the instructions guiding it carry echoes of beings who walked beside mammoths, who adapted to ice and drought, who vanished as distinct peoples yet endure within you. Something was here before you, not as legend, not as speculation, as inheritance. And every time you breathe, you animate a lineage far older and more intertwined than any simple origin story could ever contain. Your hand rests over your chest for a moment longer, feeling the steady rhythm there, and then your attention drifts outward again. Not to bones or ice this time, but to something smaller, sharper, quieter, a tool. You crouch in a shallow river valley, somewhere in Africa, nearly 300,000 years ago. The air is warm, the grass tall and whispering. In your hand is a carefully shaped stone point, not a crude chunk knocked into usefulness, but a symmetrical blade, thinned with deliberate, repeated strikes. The mainstream fact, the Middle Stone Age in Africa, beginning roughly 300,000 years ago, shows evidence of increasingly sophisticated stone tool technologies. Sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya reveal finely crafted hand axes and points, some made from materials transported long distances, suggesting planning and trade networks. You turn the imagined point over in your fingers. Its edges are even balanced. This is not random survival improvisation, this is design. Historians still argue whether certain bursts of technological innovation in prehistory reflect cognitive leaps, population pressures, environmental stress, or simply the patchy nature of the archaeological record. Sometimes it looks like innovation appears suddenly, but perhaps that's just when preservation begins. Then there's something even more delicate. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, archaeologists discovered engraved pieces of ochre dating back around 75,000 years. Crosshatch patterns carved intentionally into red pigment stones, abstract, repeated, symbolic. That's firmly established. You trace one of those crisscross patterns in your mind. It doesn't depict an animal, it doesn't mirror the sky, it's geometric, meaning without obvious reference. Historians still argue what these engravings represent: ownership marks, ritual symbols, early art for art's sake. Whatever the purpose, they suggest abstract thinking far earlier than once believed. Now you shift to another landscape, Northern Europe around 40,000 years ago, the Upper Paleolithic. Suddenly in archaeological layers you find an explosion of creativity: bone flutes, carved figurines like the Venus of Whole Fells, intricate blade technologies. For a long time, scholars referred to this as the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, implying a rapid cognitive transformation in Homo sapiens. But more recent research complicates that narrative. Similar symbolic artifacts in Africa predate this European burst by tens of thousands of years. Historians still argue whether this was truly a revolution or simply the moment when certain behaviors became archaeologically visible in new regions. Visibility is not the same as origin. You stand now in a prehistoric workshop. Someone is heat-treating stone to make it easier to shape, a technique used as early as 164,000 years ago at Pinnacle Point in South Africa. Controlled use of fire, not just for warmth or cooking, but to alter material properties. That's ingenuity layered upon ingenuity. Here's a quirky but grounded detail. Microscopic analysis of stone tools sometimes reveals residues, plant fibers, animal blood proteins, allowing researchers to infer how tools were used. A blade once dismissed as generic may turn out to have sliced reeds for weaving baskets. Evidence of perishable technologies that rarely survive because baskets rot, cloth decays, wood decomposes, stone endures, which means your view of ancient technology is skewed toward what fossilizes. You see spear points and scrapers. You do not see woven fishing nets, carved wooden containers, complex clothing. Historians still argue how advanced perishable technologies may have been tens of thousands of years ago. It's possible that sophisticated textile traditions, rope-making techniques, even complex shelters left little trace. Now imagine a small coastal society 15,000 years ago building seaworthy boats primarily from wood and fiber. If rising seas claimed their shoreline, what would remain? A few stone anchors perhaps, scattered tools. The boats themselves gone. Innovation can vanish almost entirely if its materials are fragile. You move forward in time to around 12,000 years ago in the Levant. Microliths, tiny, carefully shaped stone blades, are set into wooden shafts to create composite tools, modular technology. Replace the small blade without discarding the entire spear. That's not brute force survival, that's systems thinking. Historians still argue whether such technological bursts reflect increasing population densities encouraging idea exchange, or whether cognitive capacity had long been present but only occasionally, crystallized under the right conditions. And then, unexpectedly, you find something even older: shell beads dating back 100,000 years or more in Africa and the Levant. Small perforated shells, likely strung together as personal adornment. Adornment implies identity. Identity implies social complexity. You picture someone threading beads onto sinew, choosing patterns intentionally. Decoration is not strictly necessary for survival. It is meaning layered onto existence. Something was here before you, not merely surviving but expressing. And yet you must be careful. There is no evidence of industrial machinery 50,000 years ago. No buried steel frameworks from a forgotten skyscraper civilization. The archaeological record would likely show large-scale mining scars, unusual alloy residues, dramatic atmospheric changes. It does not. But smaller-scale complexity? That's another matter. Historians still argue how much technological knowledge may have been cyclical, gained, lost, rediscovered. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire saw certain engineering techniques fade in Europe, only to re-emerge centuries later. If knowledge can fragment within recorded history, imagine the vulnerability of innovations in deep prehistory. You stand in that ancient river valley again. The stone point glints in sunlight. It may not look like much compared to satellites and silicon chips, but in its time it represented advanced engineering, precision shaping guided by shared understanding. And perhaps somewhere, at some time you have not yet uncovered, there were clusters of innovation, regionally sophisticated, culturally rich, that did not survive environmental upheaval or demographic shifts. Not global empires lost beneath ice, but fragile experiments in complexity erased before they could scale. The river continues to flow, indifferent. You place the stone point gently back onto the earth. Tools endure when their makers do not, and sometimes they are the only quiet evidence that something far more intricate once moved through a landscape you now consider empty. The river fades behind you, and in its place rises the smell of parchment and smoke. You stand at the edge of a vast hall lined with shelves, scrolls stacked in careful rows, ink drying on fresh papyrus, scholars murmuring softly in corners lit by oil lamps. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the early 3rd century BCE in Egypt, was one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the ancient world. That's the mainstream fact. It aimed to collect all known knowledge, works of philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, geography, drama. Ships docking in Alexandria were reportedly searched for books, which were copied before originals were sometimes kept. Knowledge gathered deliberately. And then, over centuries, the library declined. Not necessarily in one dramatic inferno, but likely through a series of political conflicts, decrees, neglect, and smaller destructive events. Historians still argue whether its destruction was a singular catastrophic burning or a slow erosion across different regimes. You inhale, and the air thickens. Imagine what vanished there. Treatises on engineering, observations of stars, geographic surveys, accounts of distant lands. The Greek mathematician Archimedes wrote works that survived only in fragments, some rediscovered centuries later in palimpsests, parchments scraped and reused. One such text, the Archimedes palimpsest, revealed insights into calculus-like methods long before Newton. What else was lost entirely? You walk along the shelves, fingertips brushing scrolls that will never reach you. Knowledge is fragile. Paper burns, ink fades, oral traditions disappear when their carriers fall silent. The Library of Alexandria isn't the only example. In 213 BCE, China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, ordered the burning of books that did not align with his political philosophy. While the scale and specifics remain debated, historians still argue how much classical knowledge was suppressed or destroyed during that period. Centuries later, during the Spanish conquest of the Americas, vast numbers of Maya codices were burned by clergy who viewed them as pagan. Only 4 pre-Columbian Maya codices survive today. 4. From an entire civilization deeply invested in astronomy and calendrical systems. You pause in the imagined hall, now flickering with unstable light. Here's a grounded detail that feels almost like a whisper of resilience. Many classical Greek texts survived not in Europe, but through Arabic translations preserved and expanded upon during the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom translated, critiqued, and built upon earlier works. Knowledge migrated. It hid in new languages. Historians still argue how many ancient innovations were lost in some regions only to be rediscovered elsewhere, centuries later. Now imagine something subtler. Not a grand centralized library, but small regional archives. Wooden tablets, bark manuscripts, woven mnemonic devices held by communities that never built in stone. If climate shifts, disease, or conquest erase those communities, their intellectual traditions might vanish almost completely. You think of the Antikythera Mechanism again. A device so advanced it feels anomalous. If it had not sunk and been preserved in sediment, you might never know that Hellenistic engineers built such intricate gear systems. How many similar devices were melted down? Bronze was valuable in times of war or scarcity. Statues and tools were often repurposed. Recycling erases history efficiently. You walk toward a window overlooking the sea. Smoke curls upward now, not yet consuming everything but threatening. Historians still argue whether certain ancient technological capabilities were more widespread than surviving artifacts suggest. Roman concrete, for example, possessed properties that allowed some marine structures to endure for millennia. Only recently have scientists begun fully understanding its composition. Knowledge can exist, fade, and then be reverse-engineered centuries later. There's a quirky but sobering example from medieval Europe. The recipe for Greek fire, a Byzantine incendiary weapon, was closely guarded and eventually lost. Its precise composition remains debated today. A technology once decisive in naval warfare, now reduced to speculation. Loss does not require apocalypse, it requires interruption. You imagine a small workshop somewhere in the ancient world. An artisan develops a novel method for alloying metals, slightly improving durability. The knowledge is passed to apprentices. Then a drought displaces the community. Apprentices scatter, the technique fragments, diluted into less efficient versions. Within a few generations, it is gone. No scroll burned. No dramatic collapse. Just diffusion. Historians still argue how often this quiet erosion occurred in prehistory and antiquity. Innovations emerging locally, never scaling widely enough to fossilize in the record. You feel heat intensifying now. The imagined library begins to blaze. Scrolls curl, blacken, collapse into ash. Knowledge that once required lifetimes to gather dissolves in minutes. And yet, even here, something endures. Ideas rarely exist in only one place. They echo, they travel orally, they migrate with merchants and refugees. But not all of them survive. If a pre-Holocene society had developed advanced navigational techniques or early astronomical records and stored them on perishable materials, a single environmental catastrophe could erase them. Almost entirely, you stand amid drifting ash. Something was here before you, not only in stone and bone, but in thought, in systems of measurement, in philosophies and cosmologies that structured entire ways of life, and thought is the most fragile artifact of all. The fire dims now, leaving charred beams and smouldering remnants. You kneel and pick up a half-burned fragment of parchment. The ink is smeared, but a few symbols remain visible, just enough to hint at structure, at logic, at intention. Historians still argue how much you underestimate the intellectual depth of lost cultures, simply because their libraries did not survive. The silence after destruction is deceptive. It can make it seem as though nothing was there, but absence in the record is not absence in reality. You let the fragment fall, smoke thins. The hall empties into shadow. Civilizations do not need to build skyscrapers to be sophisticated. They need only to think deeply and to lose the means of preserving those thoughts. As the last ember fades, you understand something quietly profound. Evidence is not only buried in earth or trapped in ice, it is sometimes reduced to ash. And when it is, the past becomes harder to see, not because it wasn't there, but because its voice has been burned away. The smoke thins into darkness, and for a moment there is nothing at all. Then, a streak, a bright incision across the night sky, silent at first, almost delicate. You've seen shooting stars before, wished on them casually, barely pausing your conversation. But this one does not fade, it grows. The air trembles, the horizon flashes white. You are standing at the edge of a cosmic event. Around 66 million years ago, a massive asteroid struck near what is now Chicxulub, Mexico, contributing to the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. That's the mainstream fact, supported by a global iridium layer, shocked quartz, and a buried crater over 150 kilometers wide. You wouldn't have survived that one, not even with sunscreen. But Chicxulub is only the most famous example. Earth has been struck repeatedly throughout its history. Most impacts are small, burning up harmlessly in the atmosphere. A few are not. In 1908, over Tunguska, Siberia, an object, likely a small asteroid or comet fragment, exploded mid-air, flattening an estimated 80 million trees across 2,000 square kilometers. No crater, just devastation. That's well documented. Now imagine something slightly larger. Not dinosaur-ending, but regionally catastrophic. Historians and geologists still argue whether smaller impact events in the late Pleistocene may have affected human populations more than you currently appreciate. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis you encountered earlier sits right here at the intersection of geology and speculation. Some researchers cite microspherules, platinum anomalies, and high-temperature melt glass at certain sites dated to around 12,900 years ago. Others question the reproducibility of these findings. The debate remains unresolved. But you don't need to settle that debate to feel the vulnerability. You picture a fragmented comet entering the atmosphere, breaking apart into multiple airbursts. Shock waves ripple outward. Wildfires ignite across dry landscapes. Animals scatter. Human camps made of wood, hide, and bone offer little protection. No skyscrapers crumble, no satellites fall from orbit, just fragile settlements disrupted. Here's a grounded but humbling detail. Impact craters erode. Over tens of thousands of years, weathering, tectonics, and sedimentation can obscure smaller craters almost entirely. Some are discovered only through subtle gravitational anomalies or drilling surveys. If a moderate impact occurred over an ice sheet or shallow ocean, physical evidence might be further obscured. Historians still argue how often regional cosmic events may have altered human migration patterns without leaving dramatic, easily recognizable scars in the geological record. You step through a forest at dusk. Leaves crunch beneath your feet. Somewhere in the distance, a low rumble rolls through the air. There's also the late heavy bombardment, a hypothesized period around 4 billion years ago when impacts were far more frequent. That's ancient beyond imagination, but it reminds you that Earth's surface has been reshaped repeatedly. Even in more recent millennia, impacts have occurred. The Kali crater field in Estonia may date to around 3,500 years ago. Some researchers have speculated that local myths of fire from the sky could preserve memory of such events. Historians still argue whether those oral traditions correspond directly to specific impacts or represent broader symbolic storytelling. The line between myth and memory is thin. You feel heat brush your skin again, not from burning libraries this time, but from atmospheric friction. If an advanced Bronze Age coastal city had been struck by a significant airburst, its buildings largely wooden, its archives written on perishable material, the archaeological signature might be ambiguous. Burn layers could be attributed to warfare or accident. Shocked minerals might go unnoticed without modern analysis. That doesn't mean such an event happened. It means the planet is capable of sudden disruption. And human history is shorter than you think. Recorded history spans roughly 5,000 years. Homo sapiens have existed for about 300,000. For most of that time, your species lived in small, mobile groups. If a localized civilization had emerged and been erased 20,000 years ago, would you see clear evidence today? Maybe. Maybe not. Historians still argue how resilient early complex societies would have been to environmental shocks. Without extensive infrastructure or written redundancy, knowledge networks could collapse quickly. You look up again at the sky. Near-Earth objects are tracked today with telescopes and algorithms. You catalog potential threats, calculate trajectories, design hypothetical deflection missions. Modern civilization is aware of the risk, but awareness is recent. For most of human existence, the sky was beautiful and unpredictable. There's a quirky but sobering statistic. Objects the size of the Tunguska impactor, perhaps 50 to 60 meters across, are thought to enter Earth's atmosphere every few centuries on average. Most explode over ocean or uninhabited regions. Average is not the same as scheduled. You stand now in a clearing under stars that feel less benign. Something was here before you. Not necessarily a global technological empire erased by fire from the heavens, but countless small cultures navigating a planet that does not guarantee stability. Cosmic impacts are part of Earth's story. Volcanoes, ice ages, solar variability. None require conspiracy. None require fantasy. They require only time. You imagine a small coastal society thriving for centuries, developing ritual centers, refining tool technologies, building oral histories of their ancestors. Then, within a single generation, a rare but powerful natural event disrupts their world. Survivors migrate inland. Stories shift. Knowledge fragments. Over millennia, the original context dissolves. All that remains are scattered tools, ambiguous burn layers, perhaps myths of fire descending from the sky. Historians still argue how often you overestimate continuity in the deep past. You assume linear growth because you see the end result, your present. But growth may have been interrupted repeatedly, small civilizations blooming and fading without scaling globally. The streak in the sky fades now. Night settles once more into quiet starlight. You exhale. Earth has endured cosmic violence before you. And if something fragile and complex existed here long ago, something not yet fully uncovered, it would have faced those same indifferent forces. Not targeted, just vulnerable. The forest grows still. Above you, the stars shine with deceptive calm. And you understand that sometimes evidence is not buried because it was secret. It is buried because the universe is not gentle. The forest stills, the last imagined shockwave dissolving into a hush so complete you can almost hear your own thoughts echoing back at you. Now you find yourself in a different kind of landscape. Not desert, not ice, not ocean floor, but a lecture hall. Rows of seats, a projection screen glowing softly. Two scholars at the front, gesturing toward the same set of data and arriving at very different conclusions. This is where the quiet tension lives. On one side, mainstream archaeologists, geologists, geneticists, careful, methodical, slow to overturn established models without overwhelming evidence. On the other, independent researchers and alternative theorists who see patterns of anomaly and feel that something bigger is being overlooked. You sit in the middle, because the evidence you've walked through Göbekli Tepe, submerged coastlines, genetic ghosts, advanced ancient astronomy is real. But the interpretations vary. Mainstream scholarship operates on incremental revision. When new data appears, like pre-Clovis footprints in North America or Denisovan DNA, it adjusts the model, slowly, publicly, with footnotes and caution. Historians still argue whether this caution is healthy rigor or institutional inertia. You imagine a graph on the screen, the timeline of human development. For decades, it was drawn as a smooth incline, hunter-gatherers to farmers to cities to industry. Then discoveries began poking holes in that simplicity. Göbekli Tepe suggested monumental construction before agriculture. Ice core data revealed abrupt climate shocks. Genetics showed interbreeding between human species. Underwater archaeology hinted at drowned prehistoric landscapes. Each discovery nudged the curve into something less linear. Alternative theorists often take those nudges and extend them dramatically, proposing lost global civilizations tens of thousands of years ago, sometimes technologically advanced beyond what mainstream evidence supports. Mainstream scholars push back, pointing out the absence of large-scale mining scars, widespread industrial residues, or global material signatures that such civilizations would likely leave behind. And here's a grounded fact that weighs heavily. Industrial activity leaves distinct markers. The mid-20th century alone has left a clear radioactive signature in sediments worldwide due to nuclear testing. Plastic particles now appear in ocean cores. If a comparably industrial society had existed 50,000 years ago, traces would likely remain detectable in geology and ice. So far, they do not. But that does not invalidate every question. Historians still argue whether your current framework underestimates the potential complexity of pre-Holocene societies, particularly coastal ones now submerged. The absence of skyscrapers is not the same as the absence of organized, symbolically rich, regionally complex cultures. You shift in your seat as one scholar gestures towards satellite imagery of ancient riverbeds beneath the Sahara. Once green landscapes, now desert. Evidence of lakes and human habitation in regions you consider barren. Climate reshapes perception. Another scholar references the Sphinx in Egypt, where some researchers have suggested erosion patterns consistent with heavy rainfall, implying greater antiquity than traditionally accepted. Egyptologists generally date the Sphinx to around 2500 BCE during the reign of Pharaoh Khafre. The erosion debate remains contentious. Historians still argue whether weathering patterns reflect much older climatic conditions or later environmental factors. You notice something important. The strongest debates aren't about fantasy. They're about dating, about interpretation of erosion, about context of artifacts, about whether anomalies are genuine paradigm shifts or statistical noise. The room grows quieter as the discussion turns philosophical. What counts as evidence? Stone endures. DNA persists for a time. Ice records atmosphere, but thought, language, music, these evaporate unless encoded in durable media. Here's a quirky but telling detail. In the 19th century, many scholars dismissed the idea that Troy, the city described in Homer's epics, was a real place. It was considered myth until Heinrich Schliemann excavated a site in modern-day Turkey, matching aspects of the story. His methods were flawed, even destructive, but the city itself proved real. Myth sometimes preserves memory. Historians still argue how often oral traditions encode kernels of historical truth layered in symbolism. You lean back. Skepticism is not cynicism. It's a filter. Without it, every unusual rock formation becomes Atlantis. But rigid dismissal can also blind you to subtle shifts. Science thrives in tension between curiosity and caution. You recall the Antikythera Mechanism. If found without context, it might have been dismissed as decorative scrap. Only careful imaging revealed its complexity. How many fragments remain misunderstood in storage rooms because the right question hasn't yet been asked? The lecture hall dims. The scholars do not shout, they cite data, they question methods. They refine models. Historians still argue whether the public appetite for lost advanced civilizations reflects dissatisfaction with gradual narratives. A dramatic prequel feels more cinematic than incremental adaptation, but incremental adaptation built everything you've seen, and yet, the story is clearly more complex than once taught. Human evolution is braided, not linear. Climate shifts are abrupt, not always gentle. Coastlines drown, libraries burn, technologies flicker and vanish. You stand now at the center of that tension. Something was here before you, that is certain. Was it a globe-spanning high-tech society erased by cosmic fire? There is no solid evidence for that. Was it a series of regionally complex, symbolically rich, occasionally sophisticated cultures whose traces are fragmented by climate, sea level rise, and time? Increasingly, that seems plausible. Historians still argue where the line lies between imagination and inference, and perhaps the healthiest place to stand is here in curiosity without surrendering to fantasy. The lights in the hall fade completely now. Debate continues in journals, in field sites, in laboratories analyzing sediment and bone. You step outside into cool night air. The world feels older than your textbooks once implied. Not magical, not mythic in the way sensational headlines promise, but layered, and you sense that the evidence left behind, subtle, scattered, sometimes misread, is not a puzzle pointing to a single hidden empire. It is a mosaic, and you are still assembling it. The lecture hall dissolves behind you, its debate softening into a distant murmur, and you step back into open air. Night again. But this time it feels different. Less like a backdrop for mystery, and more like a canvas waiting for a careful thought experiment. If they were here before you, what would that actually mean? Not a silver-skinned alien council hovering above pyramids. Not a secret underground empire with glowing crystals and dramatic background music. Something quieter. You walk across a broad coastal plain 15,000 years ago, when sea levels are lower and the shoreline lies miles farther out than it does today. A river snakes toward the horizon. Clusters of wooden dwellings sit along its banks. Smoke rises from hearths. Children run barefoot over packed earth. This society is not industrial. It does not forge steel or launch satellites. But it is organized. It has seasonal gathering sites marked by carved posts. It tracks the sun's movement across the horizon with stones aligned carefully at solstices. It navigates coastlines with sturdy wooden boats, guided by stars memorized in song, that is entirely within the realm of human capability at the time. Historians still argue how socially complex late Pleistocene societies may have been, whether hierarchical leadership structures, long-distance trade networks, and symbolic architecture were more common than currently evidenced. You kneel beside a craftsman shaping a bone needle. Fine stitching allows tailored clothing suited for harsh climates. Nearby, someone weaves a net from plant fibers. Fishing yields surplus food. Surplus allows time for ritual. Ritual fosters identity. This is not fantasy. Ethnographic studies of more recent hunter-gatherer societies reveal rich social systems, oral histories spanning generations, intricate art, and complex spiritual cosmologies, all without agriculture or metallurgy. So if something like this flourished along now-drowned coasts at the end of the last ice age, what would remain today? Wood rots, fiber decays, hearths scatter into ambiguous charcoal stains, a few stone tools, perhaps a carved stone weight for a net, maybe a cluster of post holes if you're lucky, and if erosion hasn't erased them. Then the sea rises. Between about 14,000 and 8,000 years ago, global sea levels rose dramatically as ice sheets melted. That's the mainstream geological record. Coastal plains flooded, river valleys became estuaries, entire habitable zones vanished beneath advancing tides. You stand as water slowly claims the settlement, not in a single cinematic wave but year by year. A little farther inland each generation, families relocate, structures are abandoned, memory becomes story. Once, the sea was farther away, an elder says. Historians still argue how many early innovations may have been concentrated along those lost coastlines, precisely where preservation potential is lowest, and modern archaeology is most challenging. Now let's stretch gently further. What if one such society had developed advanced astronomical tracking, not through telescopes, but through meticulous generational observation? What if they had mapped seasonal star risings tied to navigation routes and ritual calendars? If that knowledge was transmitted orally, and the society fragmented under environmental stress, the continuity could break. Later cultures might inherit fragments, myths of specific stars, ritual timings without the full framework. It would not look like a lost super-civilization. It would look like scattered brilliance. You stand and look inland now. Perhaps some groups migrated and integrated with early agricultural communities, their knowledge blending, diluted but not erased. Genes mixing as you've seen, tools influencing local designs. Over centuries, origins blur. Historians still argue how often cultural diffusion in deep prehistory occurred without leaving clear archaeological fingerprints. Trade networks existed tens of thousands of years ago, obsidian transported over 100 kilometers in some regions. Ideas can travel as easily as stone. Here's a grounded but fascinating example. In Australia, Aboriginal oral traditions describe coastlines that match sea levels from over 7,000 years ago. Some stories recount lands now submerged, passed down through generations. Researchers have suggested these traditions may preserve genuine memories of post-ice age sea level rise. Memory can be astonishingly durable, but memory transforms. A drowned plane becomes a mythical sunken land. A meteor airburst becomes a fire serpent in the sky. A migrating culture hero becomes a god descending from the horizon. If they were here before you, their legacy might not be found in skyscraper ruins. It might be found in myths that feel oddly specific, in genetic fragments that don't fit neatly, in submerged terraces debated by divers, in tools whose craftsmanship appears earlier than expected, not evidence of impossible technology. Evidence of underestimated humanity. You sit on a smooth stone overlooking the ancient plain as water inches closer. The people here are not more advanced than you in raw technological output, but they are not simple either. They possess social bonds, ritual spaces, ecological knowledge tuned finely to their environment. Then a climatic shift accelerates, resources redistribute, conflict increases, populations shrink or disperse. Within 1,000 years, a blink in geological time, the cohesive identity dissolves. Archaeologically, you might detect only discontinuity, a change in tool style, a gap in occupation layers. Historians still argue whether such discontinuities represent migration, collapse, assimilation, or simple shifts in material culture. You watch the last structure succumb to encroaching tide. If they were here before you, they were likely human in every essential way, curious, adaptive, capable of both cooperation and conflict. Their evidence would be subtle, and much of it would be underwater. The night deepens. You realize that the most plausible lost civilization is not one of impossible machines, but of forgotten complexity, societies that reached impressive levels of organization within the limits of their materials, only to be fragmented by forces larger than themselves. That possibility does not require rewriting physics. It requires humility. You stand, water now lapping at your ankles in this imagined past. Something was here before you, not as fantasy, not as legend alone, but as lives lived fully in worlds reshaped by ice, fire, and sea. And perhaps the true mystery is not that you lack evidence of impossible technology, but that you are only beginning to appreciate how much brilliance can vanish without a trace. The water at your ankles recedes. The drowned plain, the vanished dwellings, the distant voices, they soften and dissolve like mist under morning light. You're no longer standing in the late Pleistocene. You are standing here now, on solid ground that feels permanent beneath your feet. But you know better. You walk through a modern city street, glass towers reflect the sky. Steel bridges hum faintly with traffic. Beneath the pavement run cables carrying light-speed messages, satellites orbit above you, invisible but constant. Your world feels indestructible in its complexity. It isn't. That's not alarmism. It's geology, the mainstream fact. Tectonic plates shift continuously. Earthquakes reshape coastlines in minutes. Volcanic eruptions bury cities in ash as Pompeii was in 79 CE, preserved in tragic stillness. Over centuries, erosion grinds mountains down grain by grain. Over millennia, sea levels rise and fall. Stability is a temporary arrangement. You pause at the edge of a construction site where the ground has been cut open. Layers of soil are visible, dark topsoil, lighter sediment beneath. If someone were to dig far enough down here 10,000 years from now, what would they find? Concrete fragments, rust traces, perhaps a scatter of ceramics. Plastic, though brittle, might leave chemical residues detectable in sediment cores. The mid-20th century's nuclear testing has already created a thin radioactive marker layer across the globe, a clear geological timestamp. If your civilization vanished tomorrow, evidence would remain, but not forever. Historians and geologists still argue how long distinct markers of industrial society would persist. Millions of years from now, plate tectonics could subduct entire ocean floors. Mountain building could recycle crust. Erosion could blur the sharp edges of your structures into unrecognizable formations. Given enough time, even skyscrapers become strange mineral veins. You walk into a quiet park, grass sways where buildings once stood a century ago. Cities rise and fall even within recorded history. Angkor in Cambodia was once a sprawling urban center of perhaps 1 million people in the 12th century. It was gradually reclaimed by jungle before being re-examined by archaeologists. Mainstream archaeology now uses LIDAR technology, laser scanning from aircraft, to reveal entire urban grids hidden beneath forest canopies. That's real. Entire landscapes invisible at ground level, suddenly illuminated from above. It makes you wonder how many more lie undiscovered, not because they are supernatural, but because they are obscured. Historians still argue how much of the ancient world remains unexcavated. The majority of archaeological sites on Earth have not been systematically explored. Many lie beneath modern cities, others beneath farmland, desert, or sea. You sit on a bench and watch people pass. Something was here before you. That truth no longer feels ominous. It feels continuous. Before your city, there may have been forest. Before forest, grassland. Before that, ice. Before ice, another ecosystem entirely. Human settlements layered atop older human settlements, atop older animal paths, atop older riverbeds. And one day, something will stand where you are not. Perhaps another version of humanity, genetically modified, technologically integrated beyond your current imagination. Perhaps a quieter species inheriting a rewilded planet. Perhaps no one at all. Historians still argue whether human civilization has reached a point of irreversible planetary impact, the Anthropocene distinct enough to mark a new geological epoch. Future geologists, if they exist, may point to plastic residues, concrete deposits, and fossil fuel carbon spikes as evidence of your time. You glance down at your hands. Your DNA carries Neanderthal echoes. Your immune system holds ancient adaptations. Your language contains words passed through thousands of years of mouths. Your calendar tracks celestial cycles observed by ancestors who stood beneath unpolluted skies. You are not the beginning. You are a layer, a brief one perhaps. There's a quiet irony in fearing that evidence of a lost civilization might lie beneath your feet, while you yourself are actively creating a future archaeological layer. Every landfill is a time capsule. Every satellite fragment orbiting above will one day fall. Every digital archive depends on electricity and maintenance. Without them, your vast libraries collapse into unreadable code. Remember Alexandria, remember drowned coastlines, remember ice cores trapping air from worlds long gone. The pattern is not conspiracy, it is impermanence. You walk toward the edge of the city, where lights thin and the sky opens again. Stars appear, faint against residual glow, but persistent. The same stars that guided Polynesian navigators, the same stars carved symbolically at Göbekli Tepe, the same stars watched by Neanderthals in Ice Age valleys. They outlast you easily. You lie back on cool grass. If something was here before you, it faced the same sky, the same planetary restlessness, the same fragile balance between innovation and vulnerability. And if future beings ever ask whether something existed before them, they may sift through your sediments and debate your anomalies. They may argue whether your sudden technological bloom was gradual or explosive. They may puzzle over your artifacts out of context. They may underestimate you or overestimate you. The wind moves softly through the grass, now barely audible. You don't need a hidden global super civilization to feel small in the best possible way. You need only the layered truth, life experiments. Civilizations flicker, knowledge accumulates, fractures, reforms, and the earth keeps most of the receipts. You close your eyes for a moment, not in fear, not in awe exactly, but in quiet acceptance. Something was here before you, something will be here after. And you, for this brief luminous stretch of time, are both evidence and ancestor. Word count 1147. Now the night grows gentler around you. The urgency fades, replaced by a slower rhythm. The wind is softer now, more like a breath than a force. Imagine the planet turning beneath you, steadily, without strain. Oceans rising and falling in patient cycles. Ice forming, melting, forming again. Forests advancing, retreating, returning in altered shapes. You are part of that turning, not separate from it. Every fossil, every buried tool, every drowned shoreline you've wandered tonight is not a warning or a secret message. It is simply continuity, layers resting upon layers, stories settling into sediment. There is comfort in that. Nothing has to last forever to matter. The ancient footprints at Lascaux were just steps across soft ash. The cave handprints were just palms pressed against stone. The carved pillars at Göbekli Tepe were raised by hands no different in their basic anatomy from yours. And here you are, breathing under the same sky. Let your thoughts slow now. Let the questions soften at the edges. You don't have to solve the debate between skeptics and dreamers. You don't have to uncover every submerged city or decode every fragment of DNA. It's enough to recognize that you're standing in the middle of a very long story. The earth is not hiding from you. It is simply vast. So feel the ground beneath you. Steady for now. Feel the quiet pulse in your chest, ancient and immediate at once. Above you, the stars hold their positions for the night, indifferent and constant. Something was here before you, and that's not unsettling. It's beautiful.